The trail marker was gone. Lena Harper stood at the fork in the trees and turned the torn scrap of orange plastic over in her fingers, the kind of plastic that was supposed to mean something left, right, safe, danger, and now it meant nothing at all because there was no second piece, no confirmation, no second marker nailed to the bark of any tree she could see. She turned in a slow circle. Pine, 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 a drop in the land that disappeared into shadow, more pine. Her phone had died 40 minutes ago. She had known it was dying. She had watched the battery crawl from 11% to 8 to 4, and she had thought, with the particular confidence of someone who had once been very good at making decisions, that she would be back at the trailhead before it mattered. She had been wrong. She was wrong about a lot of things lately, and being wrong about her phone battery felt like one insult too many on top of all the others. She folded the torn marker into her jacket pocket and picked the left fork. The trees changed almost immediately. She noticed it the way you notice the temperature when you step from one room into another, not with your eyes but with your skin. The air was different here, cooler but not in the way that meant elevation, in the way that meant something else occupied this space and had been occupying it for a long time, and the air itself had learned to behave accordingly. She kept walking because stopping felt worse than forward. She had come to this part of the county for the same reason she had been doing everything for the past 7 months, to get through one more day without sitting in the apartment she could no longer afford alone, looking at the walls of a life that had been systematically removed around her. The hiking was not healing. She was not foolish enough to call it that. It was simply motion, and motion was the only thing that kept the heaviness from settling into her bones the way it did when she was still. The left fork took her downhill for 10 minutes, then flattened out into a wide, mossy corridor between trees so old they had stopped being individual trees and become something closer to a wall. She slowed down. There were markings on the bark, not painted, carved. She did not know what they meant, and she made herself not touch them, which required effort, because her hands always wanted to touch things she did not understand, a habit that had gotten her into trouble more than once. The sound reached her before she could name it. It was low, it was not wind, it was not the creak she had been hearing on and off for the past half hour, it was a voice, one voice. Quiet, like someone speaking in a room they believed to be empty, not performing, not projecting, talking with the honest cadence of a person who expected no audience. She stopped moving. The voice was male. It was somewhere ahead and slightly to the left, behind the tree line that thickened into shadow. She could not make out words. She stood absolutely still and waited, the torn trail marker in her pocket, and after a moment the voice came again, and this time she caught the rhythm of it, though not the content. It had the quality of something intimate, something private, the kind of tone you only use when you are sure no one can hear you. Every sensible instinct she had told her to go back. She took 3 steps forward. The voice was clearer now, still not words almost, like a frequency she was just barely outside of, receiving the shape of the sound but not the meaning. She pressed closer to a wide oak and held still and listened, and something strange happened. The sounds began to separate. There was the voice she had been tracking, low, careful, male, and then beneath it, she became aware of a second channel, not a second person, the same voice, but different in texture, as though the same man was running 2 conversations simultaneously on 2 different registers, and one of them was not meant for ears at all. She pressed her back against the oak. Her brain offered her the rational explanation first. He was on a phone call. 2 ears, 2 voices in her range, confusion of proximity. She accepted this explanation and held on to it for approximately 4 seconds before the second channel resolved into something she could almost understand, and what she almost understood made no sense in the framework of a phone call. It sounded like an answer to something that had not been said aloud. The name reached her then. Her name. Not her full name, just Lena. Her name in that lower register in that second channel, the one that was not quite sound and not quite silence but something in the territory between them. And the man's audible voice responded, "No, quiet." She pressed herself flat against the oak tree. Her breath had stopped cooperating. Nobody knew she was here. She had told nobody about the trail. She had left her car at the public lot and taken the east fork of the Carver Creek Trail, which was public land, which was freely accessible, which had a 4-star review on a hiking app she had downloaded 3 months ago when she started doing this. She was nobody. She was a woman with a dead phone and a torn trail marker, and she was somebody's nobody, and there was no universe in which a strange man in the trees should know her name. She heard him move. Not toward her, she did not think toward her, but the sound of his footsteps was deliberate in a way that told her he knew exactly where he was putting his feet and why. The second channel went quiet. The first channel, the audible one, said nothing at all. She waited. One of her feet had begun to go numb from the way she was pressing into the tree, and she could not afford to shift her weight because shifting her weight would make a sound. Then nothing, then more nothing. Then a bird, somewhere above her, going about its own business with complete disregard for the tension happening below. She waited another 2 minutes by counting her own heartbeats, which was unreliable because her heartbeats were not doing anything regular, and then she moved, carefully, back up the hill she had come down, back toward the fork she had chosen incorrectly, back toward the orange plastic world of markers and trailhead signage and her dead car in the public lot. She did not run. Running was for people who knew what they were running from, and she did not know that. She walked fast and the tree corridor lengthened behind her, and by the time she reached the fork she was breathing properly again. She took the right path this time. The path that 30 minutes later opened onto the cracked asphalt of the East Trailhead parking lot where her second-hand car sat waiting like an apology. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time without starting the engine. Her name in that voice, in that register. She pulled the torn trail marker out of her pocket and set it on the dashboard. She looked at it. It did not explain anything. It was a piece of orange plastic that had once told someone which way to go, and it had come loose, and now it just sat there, unhelpful in the particular way that broken things sit when they no longer know their purpose. She started the car. She did not go back. She told herself she would not go back. She went back 4 days later. This time she charged her phone to 100%. She downloaded the offline trail map, which she should have done the first time and had not done because she had been in the business of not preparing for things for approximately 7 months now, ever since the life she had spent 4 years building had been handed back to her in pieces, the way someone hands you a box of things from your own desk after you have been let go from a job you were good at, by a company you had believed in. For reasons that had nothing to do with your performance, and everything to do with numbers on a page that had been revised downward by people you had never met. She had been laid off, and then 3 weeks later she had come home to an apartment that contained half the furniture it used to, and a note from Owen that said in his clean, unslanted handwriting that he was sorry that the timing was terrible and that he thought they had both known for a while. She had not known. That had been the worst part, not the leaving. The not knowing she had been someone who was about to be left. She parked in the same lot. She took the same East Fork. This time she walked past the first fork and did not take it, continuing on the main trail instead, which climbed slowly through ordinary forest until it opened onto a ridge with a view of the valley below that was, objectively, worth the walk. She sat on a flat rock and ate the apple she had brought, which she had also not done the first time, and she looked at the valley, and the valley was green and indifferent, which she found comforting. She went back 3 more times that month. On the 5th visit, she took the left fork again. She told herself it was curiosity. She told herself a lot of things these days, and believed most of them for approximately the same 4 seconds she had believed the phone call explanation. The truth, which she kept folded small like the trail marker, was that she had been thinking about the voice every day since she first heard it, not obsessively, not in the way that preceded something dramatic. Just in the way that something lodges in the ear and will not leave, a piece of music heard through a wall, half a sentence caught in passing at a coffee shop that arrives incomplete and stays that way, tantalizing and unfinished. The left fork was exactly as she remembered it, the drop in the land, the shadow, the cool air that was not about elevation, the ancient trees and their carved markings. She walked further this time, further than she had gone before, where the corridor opened into a wide clearing that held in its center the wreck of what had once been a wooden structure, a shelter maybe or a watchtower, she could not tell. The bones of it remained, 4 corner posts still standing somehow and the suggestion of a floor in the moss-covered boards between them. It was the kind of ruin that had been a ruin for long enough to become part of the landscape. She was standing in the middle of it, looking up through the absent roof at the gray November sky when the second channel opened. She had not heard it since the first visit. She had half convinced herself she had imagined it, that the strange double-register quality had been an effect of the trees, or of altitude, or of the state her nervous system had been in since the spring. But here it was again, and this time it was not a murmur. This time it was clearer than it had been, the way a signal gets clearer when you are no longer on the edge of its range but inside it. She could not hear words, she could hear intent. She could hear the shape of a question being formed, and the shape of an answer arriving, and the particular texture of a man who was used to carrying weight alone, thinking through something he did not want to think through with the only company he trusted. She stood in the broken shelter and listened. The second channel shifted. She felt it more than heard it, a change in direction, in attention, like an eye moving. And then it was on her, not the audible voice. The channel turned toward her the way a lamp turns a beam, not searching, already found. She felt every hair on her arms stand up beneath her jacket sleeves. She did not move. She stood in the broken shelter with the gray sky above her, and the carved trees surrounding her, and the second channel pressed against her like a held breath. And she understood, in the wordless way that the body understands things before the mind has caught up, that she had not found this place. This place had been letting her approach. She turned her head very slowly to the right. Between two of the great old trees where the shadow was deepest, a figure stood. She could not make out his face. She could make out the fact of him, broad, still, completely unhurried, in the way of someone who had nowhere else to be because they had decided this was where they needed to be and the decision was total. He did not move toward her. He did not move away. He simply stood, and the second channel was quiet now, and the audible silence between them was the loudest thing she had heard in months. She should have been frightened. She was, a little, somewhere below the surface. But the thing that rose above the fear was something she had not felt since the spring, since before the box on the desk and the note on the kitchen table, since before she had become someone who walked alone in the woods to get through the day. What rose was the specific, cellular alertness of a person who has been very alone for a long time and has just become aware of being genuinely seen. She lifted her chin. She did not say hello. She held his gaze or the shape of him because the shadow still held his face, and she did not apologize for being there, and she did not pretend she was simply passing through. The second channel spoke. She did not understand the words, but the tone was clear. She had not bowed, she had not flinched. She had stood in the clearing that belonged to something much older than she was, and she had looked back at it without blinking, and whatever lived in the second channel found that remarkable. She kept the torn trail marker on her dashboard for weeks after that. She did not throw it away. It was the kind of object that meant nothing and everything at the same time, and she was not yet ready to put it somewhere she could not see it. She drove home, she ate dinner. She sat by her window and looked at the streetlights, and held the sound of that secondary channel in her chest like something she had found on a walk, and was not yet sure she was allowed to keep. She was sure of one thing: she was going back. She had not expected to care about the trail this much. That was the first honest thing she admitted to herself on the drive home, not that she had done something foolish, not that she had frightened herself, not that she should have stayed on the public land with its painted signs and its reviewed and rated infrastructure. What she had not expected was the quality of the caring. She cared about the trail the way she cared about a piece of music she could not name, not with ownership, not with any reasonable claim, but with the specific hunger of having been given a fragment of something, and being unwilling to leave without the rest. She drove through the town that sat at the base of the mountain like an afterthought, past the petrol station, and the diner and the hardware store and the small library she had been into twice since moving to the cheaper apartment, which was the only civic institution in her current life that asked nothing of her except the willingness to carry things home. She drove past the apartment block with its unremarkable facade, and the parking space she had claimed by virtue of arriving first each morning, and the window that let in the streetlights, and she thought about the voice. She had a scientific habit, which she had developed in school and never quite shed despite the fact that she was not a scientist, the habit of wanting to establish what had actually happened before establishing what she thought about what had happened. The two operations felt different to her. You could not think about something accurately until you had looked at it clearly, and looking clearly was its own discipline, separate from analysis. She had spent a lot of time this year looking at things she had previously thought about first and looked at second, and the looking had produced revisions she had not expected and had not entirely wanted. So she looked at what had happened. A man in the trees, his voice in two registers, one audible and one not. Her name in the register that was not audible, followed by a command directed inward, quiet. These were the facts. She had no framework that explained all of them. She had partial frameworks, the research she would do later into wolf communication ranges, the documented sensory capacities of animals, the folklore and the footnotes, but she did not have it yet. So the facts sat as facts, and she did not yet require them to be explained. She parked the car. She went upstairs to the small apartment. She ate the leftovers from 2 nights ago that were still technically within the useful range. She washed the dishes with the particular thoroughness she applied to dishes when her mind was occupied elsewhere, which left the dishes extremely clean. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the streetlight doing things to the ceiling and thought, with clarity, he knew my name before I told it to him. Not a conclusion, an observation, she let it sit. She slept with it sitting, and it was still there in the morning, unchanged and unelaborated, a single clear fact in the day's first light. She made coffee and stood at the window with it and looked at the street below, where the town was beginning to have its morning in the way small towns do, gradually, without hurry, a car here and a pedestrian there, the diner opening, the hardware store not yet. She had grown up in a city. The pace of this place still felt foreign to her in certain moments, and in other moments it felt like something she had always been moving toward without knowing what it was called. She had moved here because it was affordable, and because it was 2 hours from everywhere she knew, which at the time had felt like a disadvantage and had since begun to feel like a feature. She had no one in this town who knew her face well enough to see that she was putting herself back together. She had no one here who had known the previous version, the successful and well-positioned and carefully assembled version who might mark her current state by comparison. She was simply Lena Harper, freelance contract editor, hiker, occasional library visitor. She was nobody's memory of anyone else. She liked this. She had not expected to like it as much as she did. She finished her coffee. She decided she would not go back to the left fork for 4 days. She kept this promise to herself with some difficulty and went back on the 5th day. Later, she would think that the 4-day gap had been important, not because it made the decision more considered, but because it confirmed that the decision had already been made. She had simply needed 4 days to catch up to it. She was not built for running into things, which made it ironic that she had built the habit of moving through the world at a pace that guaranteed she would eventually run into something. Lena was late, not the leisurely kind of late that still arrives within the margin of polite society, but the kind of late that arrives flushed and slightly breathless with pine needles in its hair and one of its shoelaces coming undone. She had stayed in the clearing 20 minutes longer than she intended, which was entirely the fault of a red-tailed hawk that had landed on one of the broken corner posts of the old shelter, and stayed there regarding her with a cool authority she found it impossible to walk away from. Animals, in her experience, either ignored you or confirmed your worst suspicions about yourself. This hawk had done neither. It had simply looked at her as though she were mildly interesting and not in any particular hurry to reach any particular destination, and the look had been so restful that she had sat down on the mossy boards and stayed. She left at speed. She took the main trail at a pace that was not quite running, but was doing its best impression of it, her backpack shifting with every step, her laces unraveling in stages. The main trail merged with the eastern path at a junction she had navigated a dozen times without incident. She stopped navigating without incident. She came around the bend, moving fast, looking at her laces, and she hit the bend's other occupant with a force that she would describe afterward to no one, since there was no one to describe it to, as remarkable, like walking into a wall that had chosen that exact moment to be standing there. She had the impression of impact and then of being caught, which was the strange part because it happened so fast the sequence barely registered. Forward momentum, contact, stop, hands. Not her hands, his. She looked up. She had to look up more than she expected. The man holding her by the upper arms to prevent her from bouncing backward onto the trail was very tall. She noticed this before she noticed anything else because it was the most immediate fact available to her, the angle of her own neck in order to see his face. He was looking down at her with an expression she could not immediately classify. Not amused, not alarmed, not the polite blankness people arrange on their face when a stranger collides with them in a public space. Something steadier than any of those. Dark eyes that were doing something very focused and very still. She became aware of 2 things in rapid succession. The first was that her hands were on his chest. She had not put them there deliberately, they had arrived there during the catching process, instinctively, the way hands go to walls for balance, but they were there, and the chest in question was solid in a way that registered as information. Not the fluffy, insulated kind of solid, the actual structural kind. The second was that his hands were on her arms just below her shoulders, not tight, not frightening, but warm in a way that moved through the layers of her jacket and arrived at her skin and kept going. She flinched, she felt herself do it. That backward edge of a movement, the involuntary signal, the thing her body did now when touched without warning, the thing she had not been able to stop doing since Owen had walked through their apartment pulling his things off shelves, and she had stood in the doorway unable to determine whether she was supposed to offer to help. His hands released her immediately. The speed of the release surprised her. She had expected the standard sequence: apology, steadying, more contact. She had not expected the immediate, total removal of all pressure the moment her body said no. It was so precisely calibrated to what she needed that she almost did not know what to do with it. She said, "I'm sorry. I wasn't watching where I was going." She said it to his collarbone because she still had not fully elevated her eyes to a level she could sustain. His collarbone, for the record, was also doing something noteworthy architecturally. "You are not injured," he said. It was not a question. It was the statement of someone who had already checked all the relevant information and arrived at a conclusion. She could hear the low register of his voice, the audible one, and something in her ear caught and tugged. She filed the tugging away for examination later. "No," she said, "I'm fine. I'm late actually, which is completely my own fault, and I'm not even late for anything that exists in the real world. I just told myself I'd be back at the car by 2, and it's currently," she checked her phone, "2:17 so." "You were at the shelter," he said. She stopped talking. She looked up at him fully then, which was a decision she registered afterward as significant because it was the first time she had made a full visual assessment of the situation, and the situation was visually a great deal to assess. He was younger than the authority in his voice suggested, though not young. A man who had been fully formed by something difficult and had arrived on the other side of it intact but changed. Dark hair. A face that was not soft and was not brutal, but occupied the territory between them with complete confidence. He was wearing a gray Henley that had seen considerable outdoor use and dark trousers that were not hiking trousers but were doing fine anyway, because he moved through outdoor space as though outdoor space had been designed around him. He was looking at her the way the hawk had looked at her, not evaluating, already decided and waiting to see how she would handle what she was being told. "I didn't know that place was off limits," she said. It was not entirely true. She had known the left fork led somewhere that felt different. She had chosen it anyway. "It is not a matter of limits," he said. "Then what is it a matter of?" The steady look did not waver. "Understanding what you are walking into." She considered this. What am I walking into? A pause, the kind of pause that has content, that is holding something it is deciding whether to offer. He did not offer it. He said instead, "You should take the main trail on your way out. The east branch runs close to the ridge boundary." She should have said okay. She should have said thank you, "I'll do that, sorry for the collision, have a good day." She should have picked up the thread of her laces and continued down the main trail at a pace that removed her from this situation with all due dignity. She said, "What's on the other side of the ridge boundary?" He was quiet for long enough that she had time to notice that the birds were very quiet here too, and had been since the collision, and that the light filtering through the pines had a quality she associated with late afternoon even though it was only just past 2. And then, without fully breaking the surface of his expression, something shifted in him. Not softened, she did not think he softened easily. Something that was closer to acknowledgement, as though she had passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. "My territory," he said. She absorbed this. Territory was not a word people used about land in the way he used it, possessively, completely, without any suggestion of the legal or the practical. He used it the way a person uses the word home, except stronger than that. He used it the way blood uses the word body. "I didn't mean to trespass," she said. "You did not know," he said. "Now you do." And there it was, the thing she recognized, the thing that had been tugging at her since the moment of impact. She had thought the tugging was the register of his voice, the familiar low cadence, but it was not that. It was that the secondary channel, the one she had heard in the trees, the one she had classified as imagination and then reclassified as a signal and then refused to classify at all, was present, right now, active and present and doing something she could almost resolve into meaning. Not loud, very careful, but there. She kept her face entirely neutral, which was something she was getting good at. "I'll take the main trail," she said. She thought he was going to leave it there. She thought the conversation was completing itself with the usual closing mechanics, the mutual release of two people who had collided and exchanged information and would now continue in separate directions. And then he did something unexpected. He reached out and with one finger pointed at her left boot. "Your lace," he said. She looked down. Her lace had given up all pretense and was lying flat on the trail, completely undone, a full 18 inches of pure capitulation. "Thank you," she said. She crouched and retied it. She was aware of him watching her tie her shoe with the same focused steadiness he had applied to everything else, as though watching someone perform an ordinary physical task was not any different from any other thing worth paying attention to. It was a strange thing to be watched like that, not uncomfortable exactly, uncomfortably honest. She stood up. "I'm Lena," she said, which she had not planned. "I know," he said. The words landed and she let them land. She did not ask how. She thought about the sound of her name in the secondary channel 4 days ago in the trees, the way it had arrived there before she had ever spoken it, before she had ever offered it, before she existed in this space as anything other than an unknown quantity. She thought about the voice saying quiet in response. "Do you have a name?" she asked. Another pause. This one was different from the first, not undecided, just measuring. "Callum," he said. She nodded once as though that settled something. Then she shifted her weight and started down the main trail, because she had learned enough for one afternoon, and also because there was a line she could feel very clearly, invisible, unmarked, better than any orange plastic indicator, that said this was the correct point at which to leave. She had walked perhaps 20 steps when the secondary channel opened. Not in her direction. She got the edge of it, the way you get the edge of a conversation happening in the next room when the wall is thin. It was not meant for her. It was the quality of something released when she had turned her back, something that did not need to be contained anymore, because its object was now facing the other way and could not see it. She heard the shape of it. She did not understand the words. But the tone was unmistakable. She kept walking. Her face, turned away and therefore safe, did something entirely without her permission. Her mouth moved into an expression she had not worn in 7 months, not a smile exactly, something older than a smile, something that happens in the body before the brain has agreed to it. She made it back to the main trailhead in 14 minutes. She sat in her car with her hands on the steering wheel and her jacket still on, and thought about the word territory, and thought about a pair of hands that had released her the exact moment she needed them to, and thought about the secondary channel and what she had heard in it as she walked away, and then she thought about nothing at all for a while, which was the first time she had been able to think about nothing in 7 months. She started the car. She had retied her laces at some point, she remembered. Someone had pointed them out. She looked down at her boots and they were tied neatly, practically, the way you tie laces when you are going somewhere. She drove home. She ate the dinner she had been too distracted to think about at 2:17. She stood at her kitchen window and looked at the same streetlights she always looked at, and she noticed that the heaviness that usually settled into her bones by evening was lighter tonight. Not gone, not healed, something she would not name yet, in the way that you do not name things while you are still deciding whether they are real. But lighter. That was something, that was a start. She thought about his voice on the way home. She thought about it with the same methodical attention she gave to anything she was trying to understand from the outside, in first the observable facts, then the implications, then the things the implications suggested but did not state. The voice in its audible register was controlled in a way that went past training. Some people learn to control their voice as a skill, a professional tool. His control had the quality of something that had been lived with long enough to become natural, the way you stop thinking about your breathing once you have learned to swim properly. He had been carrying his voice this way for a long time. The secondary channel was a separate question, and it was the question she kept returning to, turning over in her hands, setting down and picking back up. She had resources for the audible voice. She could look at it, compare it, research the training methodologies that produced this kind of control. She had no framework at all for the secondary channel, and the absence of a framework was creating in her a very specific kind of hunger, the kind that comes not from wanting to possess a thing but from wanting to understand it. She had always been more interested in the mechanism than the mystery. She did not want to be in the dark about this. She wanted to find the light switch. She pulled into her parking space and sat for a moment with the engine ticking as it cooled. The apartment windows were dark. She had not been here long enough to have the habit of leaving a light on, the small domestic practice of coming home to something other than an absence. She was still in the adjustment period where every evening arrival was a minor reminder that she was here alone, and not elsewhere with someone else, and the adjustment period was taking longer than she would have preferred. She went upstairs, she made tea, she sat at the table with it and thought about the word territory. She had studied linguistics at one point briefly, as an elective, in the way of someone who wanted to understand how language made meaning before it made meaning. She had retained certain things from it. One of them was the way the same word carries different semantic weight depending on who says it and in what context. Territory from a geographer was different from territory from a politician, was different from territory from a naturalist. Callum had said it in none of those ways. He had said it in a way she did not have a precedent for, with the full weight of a word that had not been borrowed from another domain, but had originated here, in this context, in this usage. My territory, 2 words, the weight of an entire world behind them. She wrapped her hands around the tea and thought about what kind of weight that was, and what it would feel like to carry it, and whether the man she had run into at the bend in the trail, the man who had caught her and released her and pointed at her laces, and said his name as though it were information to be exchanged rather than an introduction, felt that weight as a burden or as a fact. She thought it was a fact. That was the impression she had taken from him. Not a man burdened by what he carried, but a man who had stopped distinguishing between what he carried and what he was, because the carrying had been going on long enough that the distinction had dissolved. She had known a few people like that. She had never been one of them. She was, by nature and by history, the kind of person who was always aware of what she was carrying, counting it, checking it, shifting it from one hand to the other when one arm got tired. She had been carrying a great deal this year, and she had been very aware of all of it, its exact weight and texture, and the particular way it redistributed itself depending on the time of day. She set the tea down, she went to bed. She spent the next 3 weeks trying to read the book on her nightstand, and failing to get past the same 11 pages, which she would not fully understand until later, when she had finally gotten past them and could look back at the stopping point and see it for what it was. She had been trying to read about grief and expectation while still in the thick of the thing being described, and some books require you to have survived the experience before you can receive what they are saying about it. She was still surviving, she was doing it adequately was enough. She went back to the territory on the 9th day, by which point she had stopped pretending the 4-day rule was something she intended to sustain. She had always been someone who noticed more than she was supposed to. This had been a problem in various configurations throughout her life. As a child, it meant she cried at commercials and knew before her parents announced it that they had been fighting about something serious. As a student, it meant she could read the undercurrent of every seminar, who was struggling, who was pretending, who had done the reading and who had read the summary and believed they were the same thing. As a professional, it had meant she knew before the email landed that the numbers were wrong, and knowing before the email had not prevented the email, which was perhaps the most useful thing she had learned about the limits of perception. You can understand what is coming and still not be able to stop it from arriving. She did not think she was special, she had never thought so. She thought she was simply porous in ways other people weren't, and that porousness was a trait with roughly equal amounts of asset and inconvenience depending on the day. She had never, in 31 years, heard a secondary channel. She sat with this in the passenger seat of her own life, and examined it from multiple angles the way she examined everything, which was thoroughly and with a strong preference for rational conclusions. The channel was real. She had heard it 3 times now, across 2 separate visits, and the 3rd time it had been close enough that she had caught intent and texture if not content. It was not the wind. It was not her own internal monologue performing at unusual volume. It was external. It had a source. The source was Callum, which was a name she now said to herself in the same flat, investigative tone she applied to facts she was still assembling. She was not afraid of it. That was perhaps the most telling thing. She had been afraid of the situation, the trespass, the unfamiliar territory, the moment his hands released her and her body had reacted in the way that her body reacted to things now. But the channel itself had never frightened her. It had felt, from the first moment it reached her through the trees, like something she was supposed to be able to hear. She made herself not go back for a full week. It was not difficult the first 3 days. She had work, she was freelancing now, editing documents for a legal firm that communicated exclusively by email and expected 48-hour turnarounds, which suited her, because it required concentration, and concentration was the only thing that reliably put a wall between her and the particular texture of silence that lived in her apartment. She edited contracts and corrected semicolons and reorganized the grammar of indemnity clauses, And it was not her career, but it was her current, and current was enough. On the fourth day she went to the grocery store and stood in the bread aisle for a long time looking at the options, which there were too many of, and something about the abundance of bread and the absence of anyone who would have an opinion about her bread choice tipped something inside her that she managed to hold until she got to her car, and then she sat in the parking lot for 17 minutes doing her breathing exercises, which were an intervention from the 6 weeks she had spent seeing a counselor in the early summer before she ran out of reasons to keep paying for it. On the 5th day she was fine. On the 6th day she thought about the channel so specifically, and with such involuntary detail that she gave up pretending she was managing her interest in it, and instead opened her laptop and spent an hour reading about the documented sensory capacities of wolves. Not about Callum. She was not ready to examine the implications of Callum directly. She read about wolves in the way she had once read the footnotes of things she wanted to understand, circling the edges, building toward the center. She read about the frequency ranges of wolf communication, about the way a pack coordinates across distances that should not be traversable by sound. She read about the behavior of wolf packs in forested territory, about their tendency to mark and defend space without visible barrier, about the reports. She found these in the folklore-adjacent corners of the research, of individuals who described a felt sense of proximity when they crossed into pack territory, a change in the air, a change in temperature, a sense of being inside something that had edges even though the edges were invisible. She sat with her laptop open and thought about the carved markings on the bark and the cool air that was not about elevation, and the way the birds had gone quiet. She went back on the 7th day. She parked in the usual lot, charged to 100% with the offline map downloaded, and a thermos of coffee in her bag and her laces double-knotted, which she acknowledged to herself was preparation in excess of hiking requirements. She took the main trail, which she knew well by now, and at the junction she paused. She went left. The corridor received her the same as always. The carvings, the deep cool, the sense of edges. She walked to the clearing with the broken shelter and she sat down on the old moss-covered boards and she took out her coffee and drank it slowly, and she did not rush anything. The secondary channel opened after about 20 minutes. Not in her direction. It was ambient, she was within its range but not its focus. She had the impression of something at a great distance, a signal cast wide, carrying practical content. A check of some kind. She understood none of the specific meaning, only the quality of it. A leader assessing, a mind moving over terrain in the way of someone responsible for what happens on it. She sat very still and listened. Over the next 40 minutes she began to understand that the channel was not speech the way she understood speech. It was not sentences and vocabulary and the agreed-upon convention of language. It was more like weather. It had conditions, and she could read the conditions the way you read weather without knowing the technical name for every cloud formation. She could feel when the signal was relaxed, when it was focused, when it carried something that had the quality of humor. She was surprised by that one, the first time she caught it, and when it carried something that had the quality of weight. The kind of weight a person carries not because something is happening now but because something happened before and continues to live in the posture. She sat in the broken shelter and let it run over her like water and tried not to name what she was doing. She was doing, at minimum, several things she could not fully justify. She was in a place she had been strongly encouraged to leave. She was listening to something she was likely not supposed to hear. She was, in the particular and very inconvenient way of a person whose emotional landscape had been recently stripped bare, beginning to care about the quality of a stranger's weight. He did not know she was there. She was certain of that. The channel was not attending to her. It had the character of a private room whose door she had somehow been given the frequency to open. And then it changed. The quality shifted the way light shifts when a cloud moves. The ambient, ranging signal narrowed. It narrowed toward the clearing. She felt it before it arrived, the way you feel headlights before you see them. She did not run. She held her coffee and she waited. He was standing at the edge of the tree line before she saw him. Not a surprise entrance, not any kind of performance. He had simply arrived in the way that he seemed to do everything, with the completeness of someone who had decided to be somewhere, and was therefore entirely there. He looked at her sitting on the boards with her coffee in both hands and said nothing for a moment. She looked back at him. "You came back," he said. "I kept thinking about the hawk," she said. This was technically true. He moved into the clearing. He did not sit, she had the sense he did not sit often, or rather that his relationship to stillness was vertical, a kind of held readiness even in rest. He stood and looked at the sky through the absent roof of the shelter with the expression of someone who had looked at this particular sky through this particular absence many times. "How long have you been able to hear it?" he asked. She did not pretend she did not understand what he meant. "The first time I was here," she said, 4 days before you found me on the trail." He considered this. He was not surprised. That, she thought, was information. "What do you hear?" he asked. "Not words," she said, "more like tone, conditions, like weather." He turned his head and looked at her then, and there was something in the look that she would spend a long time afterward trying to describe to herself with accuracy. It was not surprise, because she had already established that he was not surprised. It was not warmth exactly, though it was not its absence either. It was the expression of a man who had been carrying something alone for a long time, and had just been told that one other person, unexpectedly, was capable of understanding the weight of it, not the details, not the full content, but the weight. "That is more than most people of your kind can access," he said. "My kind," she repeated. "Human," he said simply. She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at her coffee. Then she looked at the carved trees surrounding the clearing, and the deep old quiet of them, and the absent roof above them with its square of November sky. She was in the process of rearranging a significant number of assumptions, and she was doing it with the same methodical care she applied to reorganizing the structure of a badly written indemnity clause. One piece at a time, what holds, what connects, what can be moved without the whole thing collapsing. She said, "Your wolf." He did not say anything. "That's what I'm hearing," she said, "isn't it, the two of you?" A long pause, not a hesitation. She had noticed that he did not hesitate in the conventional sense, that his pauses were not the result of not knowing what to say but of deciding whether this was the time to say it. He made these decisions deliberately and without apparent discomfort, which she found, without meaning to, calming. "Yes," he said. She absorbed this. She had read about wolves. She had not read this. This was the part that lived in the footnote of the footnotes, in the section of the documentation that was not documentation but something older, the part of the record that had been told around fires and in small rooms and not written down at all, because the people who knew it understood that not everything that is true needs to be explained to people who won't believe it. "And your wolf," she said, "right now." He watched her. "It's saying something about me," she said. "I can feel the direction of it, I can't hear the words." Another pause. He said, "My wolf is asking why you are not frightened." She considered this. She said, "Because whatever it is, this channel, the territory, none of it has tried to hurt me." She felt the channel shift when she said it, a small thing. A change in quality that she was beginning to learn the way you learn the sounds of a house at night, what is ordinary settling and what is something else. This was not alarm, it was not calculation, it was the texture of a thing that had just been confirmed. She looked at her coffee. It was nearly empty. She had been sitting in a broken shelter in the territory of a man who ran a secondary channel with his wolf, and she was almost out of coffee, and the November sky above the absent roof was starting to go gray and thin in the way that meant mid-afternoon, and she should leave. She said, "Can I come back?" He looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. "Yes," he said. She stood up. She put her thermos back in her bag. She was careful not to look at him while she did it, not because she was afraid, but because she needed one thing in her face to be private right now, and her face at this moment was not cooperating with privacy. She walked back through the carved tree corridor to the main trail, and she took the main trail to the trailhead, and she sat in her car with the engine off for a few minutes before she could start it. The channel was quiet all the way out. He let her go clean. She drove home and sat in her kitchen and looked at her hands and thought, so that is what it is. Her earbuds were on the table. She picked one up and put it in her ear and took it out again immediately. The world with the earbuds was thinner. She had not noticed until now how thin it was. She left them on the table. She sat in the silence of her apartment, which was not quite the same silence it had been this morning, and let the quiet of the trees live in her chest a little longer. She drove home thinking about the word both, neither, a single thing with two voices. She ran this through the available frameworks in the same way she ran everything, looking for the shape of it, the structural logic, the thing that held it together. She had built the beginning of a working framework over the past weeks, assembled from the research and from what she observed directly, and the framework had a shape now even if many of its components were still provisional. She trusted provisional frameworks. They were more honest than fixed ones. A fixed framework was a thing that had stopped updating itself, and she had seen what happened to people who stopped updating. The working framework said, he was what he was, and what he was had two registers, and the two registers were not a split but a wholeness she did not yet have the right language for. The second register was not less real than the first. If anything, by the evidence of 7 weeks of listening, it was more real, the unedited version, the one that said what it noticed before the decision about whether to say it. She had been given access to the unedited version of a man who was, in his public and institutional life, very precisely edited indeed. This was not nothing. She knew this was not nothing. She also knew that what she had been given was not a simple gift. It came with weight, the weight of knowing things she had not asked to know, the weight of being in possession of information that was not hers by right, the weight of caring about what she heard. She had tried in the early weeks to listen with detachment. She had been thorough about it, as she was thorough about most things. The detachment had lasted approximately 2.5 weeks before it had become too expensive to sustain, and she had stopped pretending it was possible and started dealing with what she actually felt. What she actually felt was involved with the territory which she knew now in its winter state, the way the light shifted in the carved tree corridor at different hours, the way the clearing held weather differently from the surrounding trees, the way the main building had a particular warmth at the end of the afternoon when the sun caught the west wall, with the people she encountered in it, the young man with the packed colors who had brought her the council summons and who she now knew was called Evan, and who was far less serious when not on official duty. With the work she did at the table in the common room, which had become, by accretion and without any formal designation, her table. And with the man who had caught her before she fell, and had not, since that moment, required anything of her that she had not already decided she was willing to give. She pulled into her parking space, she gathered her bag, she went upstairs. She made dinner properly, not leftovers, the kind of dinner you make when you intend to nourish yourself rather than simply provide fuel, and she ate it at the table, which she had started doing again, eating at the table rather than standing at the counter, which was a small thing and was not a small thing. She ate and she thought about what he had said, both, neither, and then she thought about what she had said, your wolf. The thing she had said it with, the certainty of it, the simple declarative quality of a fact being stated, that was information about herself. She had arrived at that sentence without preparation. It had come out of her with the ease of something she already knew, and she had known it not from research or deduction but from the weeks of listening, from the internal architecture of what she had heard, from the way the channel held two simultaneous qualities that were distinct and were not separate. She had understood it the way she sometimes understood things, not by thinking toward them but by receiving them, by being porous enough that the understanding arrived sideways, from an angle she had not been looking at. She washed her plate, she put on the kettle. She was standing at the window with a fresh cup of tea when she realized she had not thought about Owen in several days. She checked for the hollow feeling she associated with his absence, and it was not there, not replaced by anything positive, simply absent, the way a noise is simply absent once the source of it has been removed. She made a small note of this in the practical ledger she kept of her own recovery, which was not a real ledger but an internal accounting she ran in the same way she ran the external contracts, methodically, with honesty about what was in the column and what wasn't. The column was doing better. She took her tea to bed. She lay in the dark with the streetlight on the ceiling. She was going back tomorrow, she had already decided. She was going back and she was going to sit in the shelter, and she was going to bring the book she had not been able to read, and she was going to try again, because she had the sense, gathering slowly in her over the course of the evening, that the stopping point in the book was closer to the end of what it needed to mean to her than she had thought. She was right, she would turn the page. The first time she heard him laugh, she almost fell off the mossy boards. She had been coming to the shelter for 2 weeks by then, which had settled into a pattern without either of them deciding it was a pattern. She arrived, she sat. The channel was open or it wasn't, and when it was, she listened. Some days Callum appeared. Some days he didn't, and she understood that his absence was not a comment on her presence, that he was running a territory and a pack, and whatever else it meant to be what he was, and her hour or two in the broken shelter was simply a point in a day that contained many other points, most of them more consequential than her. She had started bringing books. The books were cover. She told herself she was reading and incidentally listening, rather than listening with reading as the distraction, which would have been the honest description. The book she was currently not reading was a collection of essays she had bought for herself as a small act of economic defiance 3 weeks into the freelance contracts, a reminder that she was a person who read for pleasure and not only for $50 an hour. She had read 11 pages of it. They were good pages. She intended to read more. She was not reading them on this particular afternoon when the channel carried something with a different quality. She had been cataloging those qualities for 2 weeks now, building a vocabulary. This one was new. It started as the texture she had learned to associate with his wolf, a kind of loose, ranging ease, nothing pressing, moving through the territory the way you move through a room you know by heart. And then something in the exchange shifted, and she felt the audible, physical equivalent of a surprised noise, quickly covered, and the channel flooded with something bright and uncontrolled that she could only identify as laughter. Not the social kind, not the obligatory kind. The kind that happens when something catches you genuinely off guard and your body responds before your authority over it can intervene. She realized she had never heard him laugh like that. She had heard his voice in its careful register, steady and measured, the voice of a man who chose his words the way she chose her steps on unfamiliar ground. She had not known it was capable of this, of something released, something voluntary and warm and entirely unguarded. She stayed very still and let it move through the channel. His wolf, she had gathered, was funny, not in any way she could fully articulate, because she was still working with tone and texture rather than content, but the exchanges she could follow at the edge of her comprehension had the quality of two people who had been together long enough to have developed a private language of inside references and established comedic rhythm. His wolf was irreverent in the way of something that had absolute faith in the relationship, and could therefore afford to be ridiculous. It poked at him. It observed things with precision that she suspected was occasionally brutal. It did not, apparently, let him take himself too seriously, which struck her as a remarkable thing to give someone who had the kind of authority he carried. She sat in the broken shelter with her unread book in her lap, and thought about this man she was becoming attached to without his knowledge. That was the honest framing. She applied it to herself the way you apply a dressing to a cut, quickly, cleanly, without flinching, because if she soft-pedaled what was happening, she would not be able to make good decisions about it. She was becoming attached, to the channel, yes, to the particular quality of his private mind, yes, but also to him, the actual him in the physical world, who had caught her before she fell and released her immediately after, who had pointed at her lace, who said yes to her question with the weight of someone who had considered what that yes would cost. She thought about Owen a great deal less than she would have expected to, given how much of the spring had been spent thinking about Owen. She thought about him occasionally, and the thoughts had the quality of old photographs. She could see what the person in the photo had meant to her, but the meaning was getting the quality of the past tense. She had loved Owen, she thought, in the way you love the shape of your life when it is going well. She had loved the apartment and the plans and the sense of forward motion. Owen himself had been the vehicle, not the destination, and she had not known that while she was in it. She picked up a splinter from the board she was sitting on and worked at it with her thumbnail. The splinter was very small and she was giving it a disproportionate amount of focus, which was a thing she did. Callum arrived at the edge of the tree line. "You're early," she said without looking up, because she had felt the shift in the channel the way you feel a shadow, and she had enough points of data now to know his approach from others. "I finished," he said. He came into the clearing and leaned against one of the corner posts, still not sitting, and looked at the sky. The day was overcast, but the light was that particular winter silver that she found beautiful, and most people found merely gray. "What did you finish?" she asked. "A negotiation," he said. "With another pack. With a developer who wants to run a road through the ridge." A pause. "He no longer wants that." She looked up from her splinter. Was the negotiation the kind that involves lawyers or the kind that involves other things? "Lawyers," he said, with a faint quality in his voice that told her the other option had been on the table and had been deliberately set aside. "I prefer resolution that doesn't require cleanup." She nodded slowly. She went back to the splinter. It came free. She looked at her thumb and then flicked the splinter off the board. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. Your wolf, is it a separate entity, or is it more like part of you?" He was quiet for a moment. She had learned to wait through his pauses without filling them, which had been a skill she had to acquire because her instinct was always to keep talking when space opened, to cover silence with content. She had put a great deal of effort into covering silence with content for the last 7 months. She was learning that the effort was expensive and the result was rarely worth it. Both, he said, neither. It is the most accurate way to say it would be that I am a single thing that has 2 voices. The wolf is not separate from me, but it is the part of me that does not edit. It says what I notice before I have decided whether to say it. She thought about this. That sounds like it would be inconvenient sometimes. The channel moved. That was laughter again, briefer, quieter, but the same quality. She felt it like a hand briefly pressed to her sternum and just as briefly lifted. Frequently, he said. What does it say, she said carefully, when it notices me? The pause this time was the long kind. She did not look up from her hands. She kept her attention on the boards between her knees, on the grain of the old wood, and the way the moss had colonized the gaps between the planks, green and patient and thorough. It says, he said, slowly choosing, that you smell like someone who is in the process of putting themselves back together. She breathed out. It was supposed to come out even, and it came out slightly less than that. Not wrong, she said. It also says, he continued, and she could hear the quality of effort in it, the deliberate setting down of something he was debating not setting down, that people who are in the process of putting themselves back together should not be pushed. She was quiet. Your wolf says that, she said. Yes, he said. And what do you say? Another pause, shorter. I say that it is correct. She looked up then. He was still looking at the sky, and she had a moment, brief, clear, complete, of simply looking at him, at the steadiness of his profile and the way he held himself in the weather of November and the quality of his attention when it was turned outward. He was the most patient person she had ever been near, not passive, not inert. The specific, active patience of someone who understood that most things worth having required waiting, and who had made peace with that requirement without feeling it as a loss. She thought about the mug. There was a mug in the communal kitchen of what she had gathered was a building near the edge of his territory, some kind of residence she had pieced together where members of his pack came and went, and it was the same ceramic mug she had used on her second visit to the interior of the territory, when he had shown her the way to the main building after the rain came in unexpectedly, and she had gotten soaked, and he had said, without discussion, come inside. She had drunk tea from the mug, and she had left it on the counter, and she had gone back the next week and taken it again because it was the right size and the right weight, and she was the worst about returning things when she liked them, and also she wasn't ready to give up the excuse to go to the kitchen. The mug was currently on her nightstand. She was not going to think about that. Callum, she said. He looked at her. What is the range of the channel? How far away can I hear it? He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. He considered all her questions seriously. It varies, he said. Pack members can hear it at great distance. You should not be able to hear it at any distance. You are human and the channel does not carry to humans. A pause. That you can hear it at the range you can suggest something I do not yet fully understand. Are you trying to understand it? Yes, he said. My wolf is also very interested. I can tell, she said. It keeps checking every time I arrive. Like taking attendance. Something crossed his face that she had not seen before. It was gone quickly, but she had good eyes. It was the expression of a man who has just been told something about himself that he had not previously been told, or perhaps had not known was being done. I will mention that to it, he said. Please tell it I don't mind, she said. The check-ins, I don't mind them. The channel did something she did not have a vocabulary for yet, a quality she had not encountered in 2 weeks of listening. She held it for a moment, turning it over, and then she placed it. It was the quality of being told something unexpected and finding that the unexpected thing was precisely what you had needed to hear. She looked at her unread book. She closed it. She had known, coming back to the territory the first time, that she was walking towards something she did not have a map for. She had known, sitting in the shelter on the second visit, that whatever this was, it would require the kind of bravery she had been hoarding carefully for months, spending only on necessary things, keeping the reserves low and protected. She had known from the first moment the channel opened and her name arrived in that low register through the trees that this was going to ask something of her. She had not known it would also give something back. The secondary channel was warm, not with the heat of something urgent or demanding, with the quiet warmth of something that had been waiting patiently and was, for the first time, not waiting alone. She stayed until the silver light faded to the color of old pewter, and the birds in the carved trays settled into their evening quiet. She went home. She put the mug by her bed and turned the light off and lay in the dark, and thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who could hear what was not meant for her, and whether that was a trespass or a gift, and how long before she would have to decide. The channel stayed with her, faint as a radio signal, all the way home. She chose to think of it as a gift. She thought about him later that evening, sitting at her desk with the lamplight warm on the table, and the contract stacked at her elbow, and the mug from the Pack kitchen on her nightstand, where she had put it 2 weeks ago and had not moved since. She thought about him the way she thought about things she was not yet ready to name directly, at an angle in the adjacent room through the gap in the door. She thought about the shape of his attention and the way it fell on things without claiming them, the way he had looked at the sky through the absent roof of the shelter without needing the sky to do anything for him. She thought about the pauses, the quality of them, the particular texture of someone who had learned to let silence be a full thing rather than an empty one. She had known people who were comfortable with silence before. She had been comfortable with it herself, once, before the year had made her afraid of it, before the apartment had been too quiet, and the quiet had been the sound of a life being reduced. She had filled the quiet obsessively, with work, with audiobooks at low volume, with the radio left on in the other room. She had been afraid that if she was still and quiet, the size of what was gone would occupy the space. She was less afraid of the quiet now. She was not sure exactly when this had changed. She thought it had something to do with the shelter, with sitting in it, with the specific quality of the quiet there, which was not the quiet of absence but the quiet of age and presence, the accumulated quiet of old wood and old trees and very old intention. She had been sitting in the quiet of something that had outlasted all kinds of loss and had not been diminished by any of it, and some of that quality had seeped into her. She worked on the contracts for an hour and then she stopped working and sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. She thought about the word territory again. She had been thinking about it regularly for weeks, the way a new word occupies the ear once you have heard it for the first time, appearing in everything you read and every conversation you have. His territory, the specificity of the claim. The way he moved through it, not as an owner, not with the possessive anxiety of ownership, but with the fluid certainty of something that belongs in the way water belongs in a river, not owned but home. She wanted to understand what home felt like that way. She had been trying to build it, had been trying to construct it out of what she had available, the smaller apartment, the library, the trail, the table in the common room. She was doing fine. She was, in the practical and honest assessment, doing better than fine. She had shelter and income and food, and she was not afraid in the bodily way, and she had work she was good at, and she had started the new document, and she had the mug and the books and the channel. She had the channel. That was the part that didn't fit the accounting, the thing that couldn't be entered in any normal column because there was no category for it. She had stumbled into the private frequency of an Alpha King's most honest self, and she had been listening to it for months, and the listening had become the thing she most looked forward to each day, and she had stopped pretending that was a neutral fact. She was not neutral about it, she was not neutral about him. She put the lamp out and went to bed and lay in the dark with the mug on the nightstand, and the book she was now 50 pages into, and the contract amendment finished, and the channel quiet and distant and present, the way a compass needle points even in the dark, without needing to be seen to be working. She slept well. She was on her fourth rereading of the same paragraph when the wolf spoke directly to her. She did not immediately understand that this was what was happening. She had become accustomed to the ambient quality of the channel, to its texture and range, to the way it moved differently depending on what Callum was doing, wide and ranging when he was moving through territory, focused and deliberate when he was in a meeting, softer and more interior in the evenings when she caught the edge of it from her apartment, which was 6 miles from the territory boundary, and was not supposed to be within range, and was somehow, inexplicably, sometimes within range anyway. She had been sitting in the shelter on a Thursday morning with her laptop open. She had started bringing work, actual work, the legal contracts and their comma problems, because she could focus here better than anywhere else, and the irony of her best professional productivity occurring in an ancient broken shelter in the middle of wolf territory was not lost on her, when the channel shifted in a way that had no precedent in her catalogue of its qualities. It narrowed not toward Callum, toward her. She looked up from the laptop. Nothing visible had changed. The trees, the carved bark, the absent roof, the white December light. But the quality of the attention in the channel was unmistakable once she had the vocabulary for it, which she did, because she had been building that vocabulary carefully for 6 weeks. She recognized attention. She recognized the difference between ambient signal and directed signal, the way you recognize the difference between a room that has people in it and a room in which one of those people has just started looking at you. The wolf was looking at her. Not in any physical sense. The wolf was not here. It was somewhere on the territory. She could feel the approximate direction the way she had learned to feel direction, not with precision but with orientation, the way a compass points without explaining itself. It was some distance away. The channel bridged the distance the same way it always did, by rules she did not understand and had stopped requiring herself to understand. It was looking at her. She sat very still with her laptop open to an indemnity clause and waited. The channel sent her something. She was getting better at receiving, not at content, which still arrived as texture and tone rather than meaning, but at the intent beneath the content, which was where the real communication happened anyway. The intent was acknowledgement, recognition, the specific quality of a party that has been aware of you for a while and has decided now to make that awareness mutual. She thought, hello. Not aloud. She had no framework for sending anything back through the channel and was not certain she was capable of it. But the thought formed with the quality of an address rather than an internal statement. The channel responded. She felt it as clearly as she felt the cold coming through the gaps in the shelter boards. A response, an answer, not to what she thought but to the act of thinking toward it, the same way a hand will move toward a hand that has moved toward it before either has touched. She breathed out slowly. Her laptop screen had dimmed from inactivity. She did not reach to wake it. She sat in the breaking shelter on the cold December boards and had a conversation with the wolf of an alpha king that contained no words and no visible evidence, and was nonetheless the most direct communication she had experienced in 7 months. It told her things not in language. In the way the channel told her everything, in quality, in texture, in the particular emotional weather of something that has been watching carefully and trusts what it has observed. She assembled its message the way she assembled everything, piece by patient piece, until she could see the shape. He would not ask. She had known this, in the way she knew things she had gathered without being told directly. She knew it from the way he moved around her, circling the edge of something, never crossing to it, keeping a careful distance that was not coldness but its opposite, the distance of someone who is very aware of another person's stated and unstated preferences and is determined to respect them. He had caught her before she fell, and he had released her the moment her body said to. He had waited for her to return each time rather than coming to find her. He had answered every question she asked and offered nothing that was not invited. He would not ask. That was who he was. And she was herself. She was someone whose life had been recently, systematically dismantled by other people's decisions, who had spent 7 months rebuilding her capacity to trust her own instincts, who had been very careful about what she extended toward other people, because extension required exposure and exposure required a willingness to absorb impact if the thing you extended toward was not what you thought. She sat with the implication of this. The wolf was not wrong. If both of them waited for the other to move, nothing would move. She thought about the book on her nightstand. She had read 40 pages of it, the same 40 pages repeatedly, because she would reach the bottom of a page and realize she had not absorbed any of it and go back to the beginning of the page and try again. This had been happening for a month. She had started to understand that the book was not the problem. She said aloud into the empty shelter, "I hear you." The channel did not change exactly, but it had the quality of a held breath released. Something that had been in the posture of waiting moved into the posture of rest. She took the book out of her bag. She put it on the board beside her and looked at it. The cover was blue. She had bought it because the cover was blue and because the title had been something about the way grief and expectation interact, which had seemed relevant at the time. She had been reading the same 40 pages for a month. The pages were good. She just kept stopping at the same place. She opened it to page 41. She read for 20 minutes straight through, and the words stayed on the page where they belonged, and she absorbed them, and the world they described was clear and inhabited, and she did not stop and go back. Callum arrived at the tree line at noon. She had been listening to the channel shift as he approached. She could track him through it now, at least on the territory, by the change in the ambient quality as he moved closer. She looked up from the book, and he came into the clearing, and looked at her with the look she had catalogued as the see-what-she-knows look, the one that arrived whenever she demonstrated the channel in any way, still carrying its quality of something confirmed rather than something surprised. "Your wolf said something to me this morning," she said. He stopped walking. He was very still. "What did it say?" "It didn't say anything exactly," she said. "It communicated about patience, about who does and doesn't ask for things." She looked at him. "About bravery being required from one direction if the other direction will not supply it." He was quiet for a long moment. "That was not for you," he said, not defensively, carefully. "I know," she said. "It was anyway." He moved to the corner post and stood against it in the way she had come to know, upright, arms loose, the posture of someone holding readiness lightly. He looked at the middle distance rather than at her, which was the position he took when he was working through something. "My wolf," he said, "sometimes acts on its own assessment of what is necessary." "I don't mind," she said. "It was right." He looked at her. "I have been," she started and started again. "I lost a lot of things at once earlier this year. Not all of them were the kind you grieve. Some of them were the kind you realize slowly you had overvalued. But the process of figuring out which is which takes time, and during that time I have been very careful about what I let in." He listened without moving. "I have been less careful," she said, "about what I have been letting in here." A pause. The channel was quiet. He was not reading through it right now. He was using his eyes, and his attention was entirely on her. And she was sitting on the boards with her book and her laptop and her cold coffee and her absolute absence of defensiveness, which was a new thing for her, or rather an old thing that she had been slowly recovering, the way you recover the feeling of a limb that has been asleep. "I know," he said. She nodded. "I think I needed you to know." He pushed off the post and crossed the clearing and sat down on the boards beside her, not touching, not with anything requested or assumed, just closer, in the range where she could hear his breathing if she attended to it and could feel the warmth that he put off, which was more than a person who wasn't running a secondary channel all day would put off, which she had noticed weeks ago and quietly filed. They sat in the broken shelter in the December quiet, and she went back to her book, page 41 and continuing, and she did not explain and he did not ask for an explanation, and the wolf was warm and low in the channel and present without intrusion. She got to page 53 before she stopped. The thing she stopped at was a line about the way fear puts on the costume of prudence and convinces you that staying still is a form of wisdom. She read it twice. She looked at it the second time the way you look at something that has just described you to your own face without your permission. She turned the page. She kept reading. Outside the shelter, the December sky was pale and cold, and the carved trees stood in their old deliberate silence, and the territory breathed around them the way it always breathed, fully, unhurried, entirely itself. She had been trying to be entirely herself again for 7 months. She was not there yet. But she was closer on this board in this broken shelter than she had been in the grocery store, in the apartment, in the contracts with their comma problems. She was close enough. She reached page 60 and stopped and put the book down and said, "I'm going to ask you something and I need you to answer it honestly." "Yes," he said. "If I were not the way I have been, would you have told me something by now, without the channel, with just words?" The pause was the long kind, but not the undecided kind. The kind that was making sure the words that came out were the right ones. "Yes," he said. She breathed. "I thought so," she said. She picked the book back up. She read to page 70 before the light started to change. She went home that evening feeling lighter in her chest than she could remember. Not because anything had been resolved, nothing had been resolved, nothing had been said that changed the facts of what she was and what he was and how many differences lived in that gap, but something had been made honest. Honesty, she had learned this year, was the heaviest thing you could carry and the lightest thing you could put down. She stayed until the light changed to that particular early afternoon gray that meant 3 o'clock and the drive back through town before dark. She packed her bag. She put her laptop in first, then the book, page 70, she reminded herself, which was now a number that meant something, then the thermos. She stood up and brushed the boards off her coat. Callum had left an hour earlier. She had watched him go with the channel, tracking his movement through the territory in the way she had learned to track it, not surveillance, nothing so deliberate, just the background awareness you develop of things that occupy the same space as you on a regular basis. She knew the shape of his presence the way she knew the shape of the shelter, the carved trees, the square of sky above. She walked the corridor back to the trailhead and sat in her car for a few minutes before starting it. She thought about the wolf's communication. She had been puzzling over the mechanics of it since the morning, not the content. She had sat with the content and understood it, but the mechanism. The wolf had addressed her, had aimed the channel at her. This was different from the ambient reception she was used to, different from the directed signal she received from Callum's side, different from anything she had experienced in the weeks of listening. It had been deliberate and specific and aimed. Which meant the wolf had decided to aim it. She thought about what that meant. She had built a framework, provisional and continuously updating, but it did not include the wolf acting independently of Callum in any way that he was not aware of. She had assumed the two registers were always in some kind of parallel, that what one noticed, the other knew. But the wolf had sent her something that morning without his knowledge, or without his explicit permission, or at minimum without his instruction. The wolf had its own judgment. This did not entirely surprise her. She had gathered as much from the texture of their exchanges, the way the wolf poked and challenged and observed. But it was one thing to understand something abstractly and another to feel the direct evidence of it in her chest. The wolf had assessed the situation and decided to intervene. She drove home. She thought about this the whole way, and she thought about it through making dinner and eating it and washing up. And by the time she sat at the table in the evening, she had arrived at a conclusion that felt accurate. The wolf loved him. Whatever the wolf was, however the two registers lived in one being, however the distinction worked, the wolf loved him with the particular love of something that has been with a person through every version of them and has no interest in protecting anyone from that knowledge. The wolf wanted what was best for him. The wolf had determined what it thought that was. She did not know whether to be charmed or cautious about this. She decided ultimately on both. She decided this while looking at the book she had left on the table, page 70, a good stopping point, and she thought about the line about fear wearing the costume of prudence, and she thought about herself, and she picked the book up. She read to page 90 that night. She went to bed feeling lighter than she had in the morning. Not because the weight was gone, the weight did not go all at once. She had learned that thoroughly, but because the weight had shifted slightly, redistributed, the way weight shifts when someone else agrees to help you carry it without making a production of the offer. She had not asked anyone to help her carry anything in 7 months. She was thinking about asking. She was almost ready. The summons arrived on a Wednesday, which she would remember afterward as the most aggressively ordinary detail in an otherwise extraordinary sequence of events. Wednesday. She had been in the middle of a particularly tedious set of contract revisions, the kind where the same paragraph had been changed 4 times by 4 different lawyers who clearly had not read each other's changes, when the knock came at the door of the small room in the PAC's main building that Callum had made available to her on cold days, with no explanation offered and none requested. She had taken to working there 3 days a week. The room had good light and a desk and access to the communal kitchen where the mug lived, and no one bothered her, and the quiet was different from the quiet of her apartment. It was inhabited quiet rather than empty quiet, and the difference was significant. The knock came, she said, "Come in." He was young and careful-looking, with the particular posture of someone who has been trained to convey authority on behalf of someone else and finds the responsibility heavy. He wore the PAC's colors. She had learned to recognize the colors, a dark slate gray worn as a kind of accent, a scarf or a badge or a patch on a sleeve, and he held a folded piece of paper with the quality of someone who has been given instructions about the holding of it. "Miss Harper," he said, "the counsel will see you in an hour." She looked up from her contract. She said, "I beg your pardon." "The senior counsel," he said, "they have called a formal hearing." He cleared his throat, regarding the anomaly. She set down her pen. She looked at the young man, and he looked back at her with the expression of someone who did not make the decisions he was conveying and was very aware of the distinction. She appreciated the expression. It was honest. "Does Callum know?" she asked. "The Alpha King was informed this morning," he said. She nodded once. "All right," she said, "thank you." He left. She looked at her contract. She looked at the wall. She looked at her hands. She was not afraid exactly. She had the physiological indicators, the elevated pulse, the slight shift in how her breathing wanted to work, but she had learned to distinguish between the body preparing itself for effort and the body preparing itself for danger. This was the first. She was assembling resources, not evacuating. She had been expecting something like this. She had not known what form it would take, but she had understood in the background hum of her comprehension of this place and its structures that the situation she occupied was unusual, and that unusual situations in structured societies tend toward formal examination eventually. She had been here long enough, heard enough, been granted access enough. At some point the institution would want to know about the person at the window. She straightened her contract into a neat stack. She capped her pen. She went to the communal kitchen and poured herself a glass of water and drank it standing at the sink, looking at the yard outside where 3 members of the pack were doing something with stacked firewood. She watched them for a moment. The ease between them, the way bodies in shared purpose occupy space without thought. She had missed that, the effortless grammar of belonging to a group that knows you. She went to the hearing. The council room was in the oldest part of the building, which was much older than the rest of it. The walls were stone, not plaster over wood, and the ceiling was high and beamed, and the windows were set deep into the stone in the way of windows that had been intended to let in light without being easy to break through. There were 8 people at the table. 6 she had seen in passing over the past weeks. 2 she had not. Callum was not at the table, he was standing against the wall beside the door, arms loose at his sides, which was the position she knew as his default, except that the version of the default she had learned in the clearing was relaxed, and this was not. This was the same configuration of limbs held differently, the contained stillness of someone who has placed themselves where they need to be and is prepared to remain there. He looked at her when she came in, brief, direct, full. She held his look for the 1 second available before she turned her attention to the council. The eldest, a woman with white streaked hair and the careful eyes of someone who has spent a very long career listening for the thing under the thing that is being said, spoke first. "Lena Harper," she said, "please sit." She sat. What followed was roughly 40 minutes of questions she had not expected to be the kind she could answer well, and turned out to be exactly the kind she could answer well. They asked about the channel when she first perceived it, what she perceived, how she would describe its content. They asked about her background, her education, her family history, with a particular and methodical focus on whether any of her relatives had ever interacted with PAC territory or PAC members. They asked whether she had ever sought out this kind of contact before, or if this had been accidental. They asked whether she had shared what she knew with anyone outside the territory. She answered all of it without embellishment and without minimizing. She had the facts and she gave the facts, because facts were the only currency she trusted in a room full of people who could hear things she could not. The one she had not seen before, a man in his 50s with the quality of someone used to adversarial situations, said, "You understand that what you have accessed represents a significant security concern." "I understand that it appears that way," she said. "I also understand that I did not seek it and cannot turn it off." "You could have left," he said. "I could have," she said. "I chose not to." "Why?" She looked at him directly. "Because nothing here has harmed me, and the things I have heard have not given me any cause to believe they ever would." "What you have heard," he said, "is privileged communication within the pack. It is the equivalent of reading private correspondence." She thought about this for a moment. She said, "That is a fair description of the situation. I want to be clear that I am aware of that and I have been aware of it. I am also aware that I did not break in. The correspondence reached me." A murmur at the table. She did not look away from the man who had spoken. "The fact that it reached you," said the eldest woman smoothly, "is precisely the question." And then Callum spoke. She had not heard him take a step, but she heard his voice, and it came from closer than the wall. He had moved into the room proper without her noticing, which she noted as information about his capacity for silent movement. "I would like to address the council," he said. The eldest woman looked at him. There was a conversation in that look, the kind that happens between people with a long history and an established grammar. She said, "You may speak." "Miss Harper has represented the situation accurately," he said. "She did not seek access to the channel. The channel reached her at a range and clarity that I have not encountered in a human before. She reported this to me honestly on the second visit. She has conducted herself with complete integrity throughout." A pause. "The question before the council is not her character. It is the anomaly, and the anomaly is a matter for further study, not for restriction." "The risk," began the man in his 50s. "There is no risk," Callum said, not loudly. He did not need to say things loudly. The quality of his certainty was sufficient. "She has access to what she has access to, and she has used none of it for harm. The most thorough examination of her behavior over the past 8 weeks will find nothing that contradicts that. He had not looked at her during this. He was looking at the counsel. She felt the secondary channel ambient and careful, and in it something that was not the texture of defense. She had catalogued that, the channel's quality when he was in a meeting, the forward-leaning, deliberate tone of someone in negotiation. This was not that. This was simpler than that. This was the quality of a person speaking about something they are certain of without needing to perform the certainty. She watched her hands on the table, and did not let her face do anything she did not intend. The eldest woman asked her 2 more questions, which she answered. The counsel conferred. She looked at the deep-set windows and at the light coming through them, and at the grain of the old table, and she was aware, throughout, of Callum standing now at the edge of her peripheral vision, and of the channel, and of the thing in the channel that the wolf had not bothered to modulate in the direction she might have expected. The eldest woman said, "You may continue your access to the territory under existing conditions. The council requests that you submit to a formal interview in 6 weeks to assess whether any further guidance is necessary." A pause. "Thank you for your cooperation, Miss Harper." Lena nodded. She stood. She was very careful not to look at Callum as she left the room. She made it to the corridor before she let out the breath she had been managing. She stood in the stone-walled corridor with its old building smell of wood and cold, and something herbal she had never identified, and she pressed her back against the wall and held the breath out, and let new air in and held that too. The door opened. He did not say anything. He stood in the corridor and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the channel was doing the thing that the channel had been doing for 10 minutes now, the thing she did not have a word for, the thing that lived above warmth and below urgency and sat in the territory between them like its own kind of shelter. "Thank you," she said. "I said what was accurate," he said. "You said it on purpose," she said. "That's different." He was quiet. She pushed off the wall. "The interview in 6 weeks," she said. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "Good." She started toward the kitchen because she needed tea, and she needed to put her hands around something warm and solid, and she needed the mug. She stopped. She turned back. "Your wolf," she said. "Right now, what is it saying?" He looked at her for a long moment. The corridor was very quiet. "It is saying," he said, "that you did not flinch." She held that. She nodded once. She went to the kitchen. The anger she had reached for in the council room, the thing she kept in reserve for high-stakes moments because it was steadier than fear and faster than pride, she had not needed it. She had sat at that table in a stone room with 8 people whose traditions and structures and powers she did not fully understand, and she had answered their questions in her own voice, in her own words, without apology and without armor. She had not bowed, she had not flinched. She poured water into the kettle and looked out the kitchen window at the yard and the trees beyond it and breathed. The mug was on the counter. She picked it up and wrapped both hands around it and waited for the water to boil. Outside, the December light was thin and sharp and honest, the kind of light that shows you everything without softening it, and she stood in it and looked at the trees and thought about the word anomaly, and thought that she had spent 7 months being made to feel like one, and that this was the first place the word had arrived and not felt like an insult. She stayed in the kitchen until the tea was finished, and the warmth from the mug had moved through her hands into the rest of her. She thought about the council, the 8 faces around the old table, the questions, the deliberate quality of the examination. She had been examined before. She had been in boardrooms and review meetings and annual assessments. She had been examined by people who had decided in advance what the examination was supposed to confirm and were looking for the evidence to match their conclusion. She had also been examined by people who genuinely did not know what the conclusion would be and were attending to the evidence itself. The eldest woman on the council had been the second kind. Arthur would turn out to be the second kind too. She had not known that yet. She would find out in 6 weeks, but she had felt it in the council room, in the quality of the elder's attention. It was the attention of someone who read the full document rather than the summary. She rinsed her mug and set it back on the second shelf. She was aware, walking back through the building toward the common room and her work, of the fact that she felt settled. This was not a word she would have applied to herself at any point in the past year. She had felt determined frequently. She had felt methodical. She had felt the particular grim endurance of someone who understands that they have to get through a thing and is concentrating entirely on the getting through. These were useful feelings. They had kept her upright. This was different. Settled meant located. It meant having found the coordinates of where she was and stopped moving long enough to stand in them. She had found the coordinates, she realized, in the council room. Not in anything the council had confirmed or resolved, in the fact of her own voice in that room, saying what was accurate, without apology and without performance, and the voice being entirely her own. She went back to the contract. She worked steadily through the afternoon. Evan brought her tea at 3 without being asked, which he had started doing 2 weeks earlier, which she had never commented on because commenting on it would require him to decide whether he was doing it officially or informally, and she suspected he had not yet decided, and she liked the ambiguity of it. It was a small good thing, the tea. She was trying to pay attention to small good things. She finished the section she was working on, she saved the document, she closed the laptop. Outside, the December light had done what December light does, shortened itself, pulled back, turned the windows from pale silver to the dark of early evening in the space of what felt like a single paragraph. She had stopped being surprised by this. She had grown to like the early dark, actually. It made the morning more definite, the lights return more deliberate. She put her coat on. She walked through the main building corridor and out into the cold, and the cold was the clean kind, the kind that asks nothing of you except that you acknowledge it, and she acknowledged it, breathing out once, watching the breath. The territory was quiet at this hour. She walked the path she knew, to the main gate, through the outer yard, to where her car sat in the area that had been designated some weeks ago as available for her use. She unlocked it and got in and sat for a moment. She thought about Callum's voice in the council room. I said what was accurate. She thought about what it meant to have that said on your behalf, not flattery, not advocacy for its own sake, not the performance of support. Accuracy. He had offered it as the most solid thing available. She thought this was exactly right. She started the car and drove home through the early evening dark and thought about exactly right all the way. She was 3 paragraphs into a contract amendment at 11 at night when the channel opened at a range that made no sense. She was at home. She was 6 miles and a ridge boundary from the territory, and she was sitting at her kitchen table in her socks with a cup of cooling tea and a document full of other people's carefully protected financial arrangements. And the channel arrived the way it always arrived, not gradually, not with announcement, simply present, the way a radio signal becomes present when you drive into its range. Except she was not driving, she was sitting still. And the range should not have included her kitchen. She set down her pen. The channel had reached her at home before, occasionally at the edge of perception, the way you catch a piece of music from a distant car. She had catalogued those instances. They were faint. They were ambient. They had the quality of something that happened to be pointing her direction. This was not that. This was full clarity at 6 miles, full presence, as though the range had simply ceased to be a relevant constraint. She sat very still and listened. He was not asleep. She had learned the sleep-adjacent quality of the channel, a slow, diffuse thing that did not quite focus anywhere. This was the opposite of that. This was the awake-in-the-dark quality, which she had encountered in herself often enough over the past 7 months to recognize it immediately. The heightened quiet of a person who cannot sleep because something inside them is too active to permit it. She wrapped her hands around the cooling tea and listened. The wolf was present. She could feel both of them in the way she had come to understand the 2 registers, not separate as he had told her but distinguishable, the way you can distinguish 2 instruments playing the same note. He was working through something. The channel had the quality of that particular internal motion, not an argument, not a decision being made under time pressure, but the slow turning over of something that resisted resolution. She had seen this quality before, in the territory, on the days he arrived at the clearing carrying something he did not put into words. She did not know what it was about. She could feel the weight of it without the content. She had learned to do this, to hold the weather without requiring the name of it. She thought this was something the channel had taught her. She had spent most of her life requiring the name. Then the wolf said something. She felt it clearly this time, clearer than she had ever felt the wolf's specific address, clearer than the conversation in the clearing, clearer than the direct attention in the shelter. It was not directed at her. She was receiving it the way you receive a broadcast. It was directed at him, and it was. She paused on this word in her mind, turned it over, set it down and picked it up again. Gentle. The wolf was being gentle with him, not less honest than usual. The wolf was never less than honest. But the honesty had a quality tonight of wanting to hold rather than challenge. She could not hear words, she heard the shape. He was tired. Not the physical kind, the other kind. The kind that comes from doing something very large for a very long time without adequate rest, because the thing is necessary and there is no one else to do it, and so you do it, and you do it well, and from the outside it looks like it costs nothing. And from the inside you know that the account has been drawing down for years and you have no clear idea what the current balance is. She sat in her kitchen at 11 at night and listened to a man she was falling in love with be tired at something his wolf. The wolf said something else. She caught the quality of a name, not her name, not spoken into the channel with the directness the wolf had turned on her, but the quality of her being referenced. The wolf was talking about her. She felt the shape of it, measured, factual, the tone of something laying out evidence. He responded. She felt the response as a resistance, not denial, more like the reflexive action of someone who has been keeping something in a specific container and is still keeping it there even when the container is being questioned. The wolf persisted. She breathed slowly and quietly, as though her breathing might disturb something. The resistance shifted, not dramatically. The way ice shifts in a glass, a small movement, a change in the way the weight is distributed, a sound so subtle you almost miss it. Something in him moved. The container changed shape. And then, with a clarity she had not experienced since the first moment in the trees when she heard her own name, with the kind of clarity that stops being information and starts being feeling, the channel carried something she could not receive as texture or weather. It carried content. Brief 4 words if they had been words. They were not words, but she received them as 4 words because that was the shape of them. If she were mine. She sat with her cooling tea and did not move. The wolf responded. She felt the response as warmth, not surprise. The wolf was not surprised. She had the sense that the wolf had been waiting for this particular admission in the same patient way it waited for most things, knowing it would arrive, not requiring it to arrive on any particular schedule. He said something else. To the wolf, she felt the shape of it as a kind of helpless acknowledgement, the verbal equivalent of spreading your hands in the face of evidence you have been ignoring. The wolf said she already is. She stopped breathing for a moment. She picked it back up, one breath, then another. She sat at her kitchen table with her socks and her pen and her contract amendment, and she held what had just moved through the channel the way she held everything she needed to be careful with, lightly, with both hands, without gripping. The channel did not know she was listening to this. It had reached her by accident of range or by something she did not have a name for, the extension that had been growing quietly for weeks, the way the range kept expanding, the way the signal kept finding her further and further from its origin. She was receiving something that was not meant for her. She understood this completely. She also understood that it had arrived in her chest and was not going to leave. She put her pen down, she turned to the window. The streetlights outside were doing their usual things, indifferent and steady. She had looked at them so many times this year. They had not changed and she had not expected them to, but tonight the light through the window fell differently. Same light, different eye. She was not the same person who had driven away from the trailhead in November with the torn trail marker on her dashboard. She had been in the process of putting herself back together. She was not there yet. She was not going to be there for a while, and she had stopped requiring herself to be there on a schedule. But she was enough. She was enough right now, tonight, in her socks with her pen and her cooling tea and the channel quiet now. The channel had moved into the slow, diffuse quality that meant he was finally sleeping, to hold this thing that had arrived in her chest and know it for what it was. She thought about Owen, the note in the clean handwriting, the furniture carried out in pieces. She thought about it not with the hollow feeling she was accustomed to, but with the specific, factual clarity of something that has resolved. Some doors close, and you spend a year at the threshold not understanding why you can't go back in. And then one day you stop standing at the threshold not because the grief has ended, but because you have finally turned around and there is somewhere else to be. There was somewhere else to be. She turned back to her contract. She picked up the pen. She finished the paragraph she had been halfway through when the channel opened, and then she finished the section, and then she made herself a fresh cup of tea and kept working until midnight, which was late for her these days, and the work was good, focused, clean, her attention cooperative. The channel was quiet for the rest of the night. She went to bed at 12:30 and lay in the dark, and thought about 4 words that had not been words. She thought about what it meant that the wolf had said she already is. Not you could be, not she might be, already is, the present tense. The fact of a thing that existed whether or not anyone had said it aloud, whether or not the appropriate container had been found for it, whether or not the person who needed to say it had managed to say it yet. The wolf knew, the wolf had always known, she thought. It had watched her from the first, the check-ins she had described to Callum, the daily taking of attendance, the particular quality of its attention every time she arrived in the clearing. It had been patient with both of them. With him who would not ask, with her who was still deciding whether she was brave enough. The candle she had lit during a power outage 3 weeks ago had been sitting on her windowsill. She had never blown it out. She looked at the cold wax in the dark and thought it had not needed to be a candle. But it had been one, and it had burned while the lights were out, and afterward she had not been able to bring herself to put it away. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would go to the territory. She would sit in the shelter, or she would sit in the kitchen with the mug, or she would walk the carved tree corridor, and think about what she was going to do with the thing that had arrived in her chest tonight through 6 miles of range it should not have crossed. She would figure it out. She was better at figuring things out than she had been a year ago. Difficulty was not the same as impossibility. She had proved that in the council room. She had proved it every time she retied her laces and went back. She slept. The channel was quiet and distant, and she slept inside it like sleeping inside the sound of a river that runs close enough to hear, but will not come over its banks. It was the best sleep she had had since spring. She woke at 6:30 and lay in the pale gray of the January morning and thought about the word already. She was a person who paid attention to words. Not as a professional habit, her professional engagement with language was clinical, concerned with clarity and precision, and the prevention of ambiguity in contexts where ambiguity was expensive. She paid attention to words as a personal one. She had always found that the words people chose told you more about what they meant than the content of what they said. Word choice was involuntary in a way that content was not. You could control your story. You could not always control the words you reached for to tell it. Already is, not will be, not could be, already. She turned this over in the light. Already was a word that presupposed a fact in existence. You used already to describe things that were not hypothetical, not future, not potential. You used already about things that had arrived, things whose arrival you might not have noticed but which had happened regardless of the noticing. The noticing was not the arrival was the arrival. She got up and made coffee and stood at the window. The street below was quiet in the particular way of very early January mornings, the world still in the attitude of the year being new and not yet having committed to any of the things the year would turn out to be. She found January honest for this reason. All months made promises. January made none. It was simply the beginning without ornament. She thought about beginnings. She had not thought of herself as being at a beginning for most of the past year. She had thought of herself as being at a continuing, a sustained effort in the ongoing project of surviving and rebuilding. Beginnings were for things that started from nothing. She had not been nothing. She had been reduced but not emptied, damaged but not destroyed. She had continued. But the channel had arrived like a beginning. The first moment in the trees, her name in that register she had no framework for, had not felt like a continuation of what came before. It had felt like the first line of something that had not existed before that moment. She had been walking and a door she had not seen had opened, and she had walked through it not because she had decided to, but because the momentum of her life had been pointing in that direction all along. She poured more coffee, she sat at the table, she thought about what she was going to do with this. She was going to the territory today, that was decided. She had work, she always had work, the contracts were a reliable constant, and she was going to do it at the common room table. She was going to sit in the January light, and do the work she was good at, and the channel would be ambient or it would not, and Callum would be there or he would not, and she was going to be exactly where she was with no pretense of being anywhere else. She thought she had been pretending for months, not about the territory, she had been honest there or as honest as she knew how to be. She had been pretending in the city at the smaller apartment in the grocery store bread aisle. She had been performing the version of herself that was fine, that was handling it, that had things sorted. She had been giving people the clean version because the real version required them to hold things she could not ask them to hold. The territory had not required a clean version. The territory, the channel, had received the real version without being asked, and without making a production of receiving it. She had arrived in her trespassing, wrong-turn, dead phone state and had been received as she was, and had been permitted to return as she was, and had been listened to and asked questions and pointed at her laces and been told yes when she asked to come back. She was going to stop pretending. Not dramatically, not with a declaration or a scene or an announcement, quietly in the way she did most things that mattered, by simply stopping the behavior that was no longer serving her and not replacing it with anything except the truth. The truth was that she was better. She was not done being better, but she was better than she had been, and the better had a direction, and the direction was clear. She drove to the territory at 8 in the morning with the January light white and cold on the road and the radio off. She had stopped needing the radio, and she thought about the wolf saying she already is. She believed it. She had believed it since the night she heard it. She was simply arriving at last, at the point where believing it and living as though it were true were the same thing. She had practiced the conversation approximately 14 times. Not out loud. She was not at the stage of speaking to empty rooms, though she had come close to it once in the grocery store when she had been working through the phrasing of the annual review she owed the legal firm and had almost addressed a shelf of canned tomatoes on the subject of her billing rate. She had practiced in the way she always practiced difficult things, in the background of other activities, running the structure while her hands were busy with something else, while editing, while making coffee, while driving the 6 miles to the territory boundary with the trail marker still on her dashboard, which she knew she should have thrown away months ago, and which she had decided she was allowed to keep. She had the opening. The opening was, I need to tell you something about the channel. Specifically about what I can and cannot hear, and about the range at which I can hear it, because I think you believe the range is smaller than it actually is. From the opening, the conversation went in a direction she thought was manageable. She would tell him about the range, about the 6-mile incident, about the nights at home when it reached her. She would say this clearly and without apology, because she had done nothing wrong in receiving something that arrived at her without invitation. But she would say it with the full transparency of someone who understood that the receiving had consequences and who was not interested in sitting on consequences. That was the plan. The plan was clean and clear, and she had practiced it 14 times. She sat across from him at the small table in the corner of the main building's common room. She had started sitting at this table on the days she worked inside, and he had started arriving at it on those days, with the naturalness of something that had simply organized itself without requiring discussion. And she opened her mouth and said, I have been meaning to tell you something. I know, he said. She stopped. He was looking at her with the look she had catalogued carefully and still could not fully translate, the look that held more than it offered, that existed in the narrow corridor between what he knew and what he chose to say. He had his hands around his own cup. He had been reading something when she arrived, a stack of documents that he had set aside, and the stack sat at his elbow with a paperweight holding it flat, and she was looking at the paperweight because it was a smooth piece of dark stone, and she needed something specific to look at. You know what, she said. I have known for 3 days, he said. 3 days, she ran the arithmetic. 3 days ago was Wednesday, the night at her kitchen table, the contract amendment and the cooling tea and the channel arriving at a range it should not have crossed. That I could hear it, she said. That you had heard it, he said. There was a distinction in there, she felt it. She was quiet for a moment. How, she said. The wolf, he said. It told me the following morning. Your wolf told you, she said. Yes. She absorbed this. The wolf which had said she already is. The wolf which had been aware of the range all along, she suspected, which had been extending toward her, checking in on her, perhaps understanding something about the channel's reach that she had only recently understood herself. The wolf had let it happen and then told him after the fact, which was consistent with everything she had observed about the wolf's approach to this situation. What did it tell you exactly, she said. He was quiet for a moment. That you had heard the channel at significant distance, that you had heard specific content. She looked at the stone paperweight. It was very smooth. Someone had handled it for years, she thought, until the surface was polished not by craft but by care. I wasn't going to say anything about the specific content, she said. I was just going to tell you about the range. I know, he said. How do you know that? Because you are careful, he said, and because you understand what is yours and what is not. She looked up from the paperweight. He was looking at her, not with the see-what-she-knows look, not with the careful consideration of someone managing the space between them. He was looking at her with the look under all of those looks, the one she had been aware of peripherally for weeks, the one she had been careful not to look at directly in the way you are careful not to look directly at a light source when you are not sure of its strength. She looked at it directly. "I heard 3 days ago," she said. "I have heard things before, not that clearly but not nothing." "I know," he said, and then quieter, "I should have managed the range better." "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Don't make it into a failure of management," she said. "It was not a security breach. It was the channel finding what it was looking for." She paused, "I think." A long silence. The common room was empty at this hour. The fire in the corner hearth was small but present. Outside the deep-set windows, the January light was doing its flat, honest thing. "What you heard," he said, not a question, the beginning of an acknowledgement. "You don't have to," she said. "I want to," he said. She held her cup. It was warm. She had been holding warm things as an anchor for months now, and she had become very good at it, and she was grateful for the warmth. "I heard the quality of it," she said. "Not the words, there are no words in the channel, but I heard the shape." She looked at the fire. 4 words if they had been words. He did not ask her to say them. She understood this was because he knew them. They were his. She said anyway, "If she were mine." The fire did small things in the hearth. The paperweight sat in its place. Her fork was on the table between them, and she had been straightening it for the past 5 minutes without being aware of it, and it was now exactly parallel to the table's edge, which it had not been when she sat down, and she stopped straightening it. "And then your wolf," she said. He was very still. "Your wolf said I already am," she said, "past the conditional, the already." He breathed. She watched him breathe. She had learned his breathing as part of the channel's accompanying register, the way his breath changed when the channel changed, the pace of it in meetings versus clearings versus this table. She knew this breath. It was the one that came when something long carried had been set down. "My wolf," he said, "is not wrong." "I know," she said. They sat with that. The fire, the paperweight, the fork she had stopped straightening, the January light doing nothing more complex than being light, falling on the table between them where 2 cups sat, and where the space that had always been politely managed had just been quietly and completely changed. "I don't know how to do this," she said, not apologetically, factually. "I don't know how the parts of it that are what you are, how those work with the parts of it that are what I am. I don't know the rules." "There are no fixed rules," he said. "There are things I will tell you if you want to know them." "I want to know them," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him, he looked at her. The particular look that she had studied and catalogued and still could not fully translate was doing the thing it did when it was most itself, not managing, not measuring, not deciding. Just looking at her the way you look at something you have been looking at for a long time and have not yet figured out how to stop. "The channel," she said, will it keep extending, the range?" "I don't know," he said. "I have not had cause to study it before." "That is the most scientifically honest thing you have ever said to me," she said. The channel moved. She felt the warmth of it, the specific warmth that was laughter without its sound. She looked at the table. She looked at the fork she had made perfectly parallel. She looked at the fire. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she picked up her cup and drank the last of what was in it, which was cold, which did not matter. She set the cup down. She straightened the fork one last time and then made herself stop touching it. She was going to need more conversations. She was going to need the things he had said he would tell her, and she was going to need time to understand them, and she was going to need to keep sitting at this table on the days she worked inside, and the days she sat in the broken shelter, and the days the channel found her 6 miles away in her socks at midnight. She was going to need all of that, and she was not afraid of needing it. She had rebuilt things from less. She pulled her bag toward her and took out her laptop. She had 3 hours before her afternoon meeting with the council's administrative liaison about the 6-week review, and she had 2 contract sections left, and she was going to finish them. He picked up his documents from the stack and settled the paperweight back into place. They worked at the small table in the corner of the common room, with the January light on the table between them and the fire small and present in the hearth, and the channel warm and steady as weather that has finally decided what it is. She thought, walking to the kitchen 20 minutes later, about what it meant to have a conversation go differently from how you practiced it, and have that be the better outcome. She had practiced 14 versions of the opener. She had run the logic of several midpoints and 3 possible landing points. She had prepared, in the way she prepared for things, thoroughly and with the full deployment of her analytic faculties, because she was not someone who walked into important conversations without a structural plan, and she had never successfully changed that about herself despite occasional wishes to the contrary. None of her structural plans had allowed for, "I know," said by him at the first opening, cutting the whole architecture of the approach she had built at the ankles. He had known for 3 days and had waited for her to come to him. He had not come to her. He had not said anything in the common room, at the small table in the afternoons they had spent working in parallel, had sat with the knowledge and let her have the time to arrive at the conversation on her own terms, on her own timeline, with whatever she needed to say and however she chose to say it. She stood in the kitchen waiting for the kettle and thought about this. She had a theory about why people became trustworthy, which she had developed this year partly as a survival tool and partly as the natural result of having time to think about things she had previously been too busy to think about. Her theory was that trustworthiness was not a trait, it was a practice. It was the accumulation of small decisions, made consistently over time, in the direction of honoring the other person's experience and pace. You could not decide to be trustworthy and then be trustworthy. You became trustworthy by doing the trustworthy thing each time the choice presented itself. He had been doing the trustworthy thing each time the choice presented itself for 3 months. He had released her when she flinched. He had said yes when she asked to return. He had answered her questions without managing what she was allowed to ask. He had stood before the council and said what was accurate. He had waited 3 days with knowledge that could have changed the conversation and instead had let the conversation develop on her terms. He had done all of this without telling her he was doing it, without making it a demonstration, without any of the performance of trustworthiness that she had encountered from people who were engaged in the performance rather than the practice. The kettle boiled, she poured water over the tea, she waited. The mug was in her hands by the time she arrived at the thought that she had been building toward without knowing it. This was what she wanted, not the fact of him, not the channel or the territory or the specific and remarkable quality of his attention when it landed on her. Not only those things, she wanted the practice of this, the accumulated small decisions in each other's direction, the working at the same table in the January light. The 12 weeks of trust that had been constructed not by talking about trust, but by the repeated choice to act from it. She wanted to make the repeated choice too. She went back to the common room with her tea and her laptop, and her growing understanding that the conversation in the liaison office in 6 weeks was going to produce an answer she had already known for some time. She sat down. She opened the document she was adding to slowly. She wrote 2 paragraphs that surprised her, the kind of paragraphs that arrive when you have been carrying a thing long enough that it finally stops being carried and starts becoming itself. She saved the document. She went back to the contracts. She worked until evening, and the work was good, and the common room was quiet, and the channel was warm and steady in the background of everything, and she did not need it to do anything more than what it was doing, which was simply being present. Presence, she had learned this year, was underrated. Presence was a gift you could give without any resource other than yourself, and it was the gift most people failed to give because they were always somewhere else at the same time, thinking about the somewhere else, planning for it, worrying about it. She had been somewhere else for most of the year, and she had come back to the immediate, to this chair, this table, this work, this channel. She was glad to be back. The council's administrative liaison was a precise man named Arthur who had the quality of someone who had spent 30 years becoming very good at making complicated things appear simple on paper, and who had developed, in the process, a fine sensitivity for when someone was giving him a clean version of a complicated situation. He sat across from her at the liaison office table on the afternoon of the 6-week review with a folder of her answers to the council's written questions and the particular expression of a person who is about to ask the question that exists beneath all the other questions. She had been expecting it. She was prepared for it the way she was prepared for everything she could see coming, thoroughly, with research, and with the clear understanding that preparation did not guarantee comfort. "Miss Harper," he said, setting down his pen, "the council's primary inquiry has been about your access to the channel. I want to ask you about something else." "All right," she said. What brought you to this territory in the first instance? She had answered this question in the written form. She had given the factual answer. She had been hiking, she had taken the wrong fork, she had ended up on private territory by mistake. This was true. It was also the surface of something that went deeper, and Arthur's expression told her that the surface answer had been sufficient for the written form and was not going to be sufficient for this conversation. She looked at her hands on the table. She had not told anyone the full version. She had told the factual version, the layoff, the apartment, the months of freelance work, to people who asked in the stripped-down, uncomplaining way she had cultivated because the full version required a level of exposure she had not been willing to offer. She had told herself this was privacy. She had begun to understand it was something closer to not yet. The truthful version, she said, is longer than the form allowed for. We have time, Arthur said. She looked at the window. The February light outside was thin and precise. She had spent 7 months in the thin, precise light of a life that had been reduced, and she had not talked about it with real honesty to anyone in that time, except in the slow, non-verbal language of the Channel to Callum. She told Arthur, not all of it, but the structural truth of it, the company, the layoff, the specific way the timing of Owen's decision had compounded the financial reality into something that felt not merely difficult but designed, as though the universe were running an experiment on the precise tolerance of her capacity to continue. She told him about the apartment, which she had left because she could no longer afford it, and the smaller apartment she lived in now, which she could afford, which was fine, which had a different quality of quiet. She told him about the hiking, that it had started as pure motion and had turned into something she returned to because the forest had a quality that the city did not, which was that it did not require anything of her. It was indifferent in a way that felt paradoxically restful. She told him that she had come from the East Trailhead because the Carver Creek Trail was free and accessible, and she had downloaded the map with all the information she had, and had still managed to end up on private territory. She told him that she had come back because she had heard a voice that did not sound like anything she had heard before. Arthur listened through all of it with the precise attention of a man who hears a great deal and says very little. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You understand, he said, that the council was concerned initially that your presence might have been deliberate, that someone might have sent you. I know, she said, I understand why. Can you tell me, he said carefully, what the money situation looks like now, the financial reality you mentioned? She looked at the table. This was the question. This was the one that lived at the base of all the other questions, the one about resources and independence and what a person is willing to do when the distance between their current state and a better one is long enough. It was a fair question. She did not like it. She answered it honestly. The freelance contracts were sufficient for the smaller apartment and her expenses. She had no savings worth mentioning. She had no family money. Her parents were both gone, her father when she was 12 and her mother 2 years after the layoff, which had been a different kind of loss at a time when she had been already running low on the resources loss requires. She had in the drawer of her kitchen table an amount of money she referred to mentally as the hard limit, the line below which she would need to make a different decision about her situation. She was not below it. She was not above it by any comfortable margin. Arthur nodded. He noted something. She watched him note it. I should tell you, she said, that I am aware of how this reads, that a person in a financially compromised situation who has ended up with significant access to a powerful community and who has developed a personal connection to its leader, I understand the pattern that resembles. Arthur looked up from his notes. I am not that pattern, she said. But I understand that the only evidence I can offer of that is my behavior over time, and the council has had 8 weeks of it, and I will continue to offer it, and I think that is all I have. Arthur set his pen down. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has been doing this job for a long time and has developed a particular feeling for the difference between truth and the performance of truth. The Alpha King came to speak to the council privately yesterday, he said. She kept her expression neutral. The Channel had been present yesterday. She had felt it from the territory, the focused, deliberate quality of a meeting. She had not tried to listen closely. She had been editing a particularly tedious section of a corporate acquisition agreement and had used it as a focus exercise. He provided a comprehensive account of the past 3 months, Arthur said. His account of your character and conduct matched yours precisely. He also made a formal request. She waited. He has asked the council to recognize your access to the territory not as an anomaly requiring monitoring, but as a matter of established relationship. Arthur paused, choosing words with the care of a man who understood the weight of them, which carries different implications under pack law. She breathed carefully. He did not discuss this with me, she said. No, Arthur said, I understand. I believe it was another pause, his decision to make and yours to decide what to do with. She sat in the liaison office with the February light through the window and thought about the word request, and about what it meant in the context of pack law, which she was still learning, and about the fact that he had done this without telling her, and about whether that felt like a thing done to her or a thing done for her, and she held both possibilities and examined them. He had caught her before she fell and released her immediately. He had waited. He had answered questions and offered nothing uninvited. He had stood before the council and said what was accurate without embellishment. He had known for 3 days about the channel and had let her come to him when she was ready. She thought about the 4 words that had not been words. She thought about the wolf saying she already is. She thought about her mother, who had died in April during the worst of the hard year, who had been a straightforward woman with no patience for people who could not make up their minds about what they wanted and enormous patience for the process of figuring out what that was. She thought about her mother saying once, about a different situation entirely. Sometimes the decision has already been made, and you're just waiting to catch up to it. I need to speak to him, she said. Of course, Arthur said. He closed the folder. He recapped his pen. I will note that the 6-week review has concluded satisfactorily. There will be no further formal review requirements. He paused. Welcome, Miss Harper. She stood. She held out her hand. He shook it with the gravity of a man who understood that some handshakes are ordinary and some are not. She found Callum in his office, which was the room off the main corridor that she had been in twice before, once for a practical conversation about territory maps and once, weeks ago now, to collect a document she needed for the contract firm that had ended up not being the real reason for the visit. He was at his desk and he looked up when she opened the door. She closed the door behind her. She said, Arthur told me about the request. He was very still. You should have told me first, she said. Yes, he said. I am not angry, she said. I want to be clear about that, I am not angry. But that was a significant decision about my situation, and I needed to know about it from you, not from your administrative liaison. You are right, he said. I intended to tell you. I made the request first because I was uncertain whether to make it at all, and then once made I should have told you the same day. I did not. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment, because I was not sure of your answer. She absorbed this. She thought about the wolf, and about the patience it required to be someone who would not ask, and about the specific vulnerability of making a request through the official channel because the direct one felt like too much exposure. She understood that. She had been living in the territory of too much exposure for most of the past year. She had made the same choices, the indirect, the formal, the protected. She crossed the room to the desk. She sat down on the edge of it, which she had never done before, which felt like a statement she was making without requiring a verbal form for it. She said, the answer is yes. He looked at her. I want to be clear about that too, she said. The answer to the request is yes, not because of anything practical. Not because of the money or the access or the territory. Because of the past 3 months which have been, she stopped and started again, the best 3 months I have had in a long time and possibly longer than that. He was still looking at her. She had looked back at things for 3 months now, she kept looking. I am still putting myself back together, she said. That is still true, it will be true for a while. I am not going to pretend I am finished because that would not be honest, and I have been trying very hard to be honest with you. I know, he said. But she said, I am enough right now. Whatever I am right now is enough to say yes to this. He stood up from the desk. He was taller than the desk required him to be, and the movement put him very close to her, not by design, simply by the physics of the room and the desk, and the small amount of space available to someone who has just stood up. The channel was open. She felt it with her whole chest, warm and present and not waiting anymore. She said, Your wolf. He said, Yes. What is it doing right now? A pause. He said, It is not saying anything at all. She thought about the photograph she had described to Arthur. She could not have said why she described it. The conversation had moved in the direction of personal history, and the photograph had surfaced as an example of the kind of thing the hard year had taken from her that she had not expected to grieve. A specific image. Her mother and herself at her mother's kitchen table, in the year before the illness had started, making something. She could not remember what they were making. Only the position of the light and the direction of her mother's hands and the expression on her face, which was the expression of a woman who was entirely present in the moment she was in. She had not brought the photograph with her. She had not owned it for a year. It had been in the apartment she left, and she had left it. She had the memory of it, and memories of photographs are accurate about feeling and inaccurate about detail, and she had described it to Arthur with the accuracy of someone who has memorized something without meaning to, which was its own kind of keeping. She thought about it now in this room in this February light, her mother at the table entirely present. She was entirely present. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. She was going to need all of it still, the time and the conversations and the things he would tell her, and the things she would need to tell him, and the long, careful, patient work of building something at the intersection of two very different kinds of life. She was not frightened of the work. She had done harder things in worse conditions with less. What she had now was more than she had come to the territory with. She had arrived with a dead phone and a wrong turn and 7 months of broken things. She had something else now. She was not going to waste it. She slid off the edge of the desk. She picked up her bag from the chair where she had put it. "I am going to finish my contracts," she said, "and then I am going to make tea, and tomorrow I want to ask you about territory boundaries and the formal implications of the Council's recognition, because I need to understand the structure." "Of course," he said. "And I am going to need to call someone," she said, "about the photograph." He did not ask about the photograph. He looked at her with the look that was most itself, the one that was just looking at her, and he said, "Yes." She went to the kitchen, she made tea. She sat at the table with her contracts, and she was, for the first time in as long as she could honestly remember, entirely located. Not arrived exactly, not finished, but located at present in the exact coordinates of her own life, which were these, right now, this table, this mug, this territory, this channel that ran warm and steady and held no conditions she could not meet. That was enough. That was more than enough. She stayed later than usual at the territory that day. The afternoon meeting with Arthur had run long, and afterward she had sat at the common room table and worked for another 2 hours, and then she had walked to the cleared path at the western edge of the territory and stood in the last of the February light and breathed. The western edge was where the territory met the managed forest that ran down to the public land. She had not been here before. She had been working her way outward from the shelter and the main building in gradual arcs, learning the geography the way she learned everything, from the center outward in expanding rings. This edge had a different quality from the interior. It was the place where the territory was most aware of itself, most defined, the way a word means most at its borders. She stood at the edge and looked out at the managed forest and thought about borders. She had spent a year making herself small, reducing her footprint, narrowing her range, pulling in. She had done it out of necessity, and she had done it well, and she did not regret it. You did what the situation required. The situation had required a smaller shape, and she had been a smaller shape. But smaller was not final. Smaller was a phase. She was beginning to expand again. She could feel it happening, actually feel it, in the way her attention operated now versus how it had operated at the start of the year. At the start of the year, her attention had been a very tight beam pointed at the immediate practical requirements. Get through the day, pay the rent, finish the contract, get through the next day. Survival scale attention, useful, limited. Now her attention was wider. It moved around. It arrived unsummoned at things like the quality of the February light on the managed forest and the distinction between two kinds of quiet and the particular satisfaction of a paragraph that said exactly what it needed to say without any extra language around it. It arrived at Callum's profile against a winter sky. It arrived at Arthur's expression when she handed him the truth instead of the clean version, and the specific way that expression changed. Her attention was reaching further, and what it reached was richer. She turned back from the western edge and walked the path to the main building. The territory was dark now at the edges where the trees were thick, and lit in the open areas by the pale early evening sky that held the last of the sunset behind the western ridge. She walked through it knowing where she was in it. knowing its shape the way you know the shape of a space you have moved through many times. She thought about Arthur saying welcome. She thought about the two words and what they had asked of her to receive, not just the welcome itself, but the understanding of what was being welcomed. Not just, you may use the territory, something larger. Something that started with that and continued into territory she was still mapping. She went to the kitchen. She rinsed her mug, the one from the second shelf, and dried it and put it back. She put her bag on her shoulder. She walked out to her car. She sat in the driver's seat and thought about calling her aunt. She had been thinking about it since February and had been waiting for the right time, which she was starting to understand was a delay strategy rather than a genuine belief in right times. The right time was now. The right time was usually now. She picked up her phone. Her aunt answered on the third ring, in the voice Lena had grown up associating with reliability, unchanged by time or distance, precise and warm in the way of people who do not require circumstances to validate their feelings. "Lena," she said. "Hi," Lena said. "I know it's been a while. I have some things I want to tell you." She sat in the car for an hour. She told her aunt about the year, the real year, the full version, the one she had given no one in the clean version months. She told her about the company and Owen and the apartment and the smaller apartment and the hiking and the wrong turn and the territory and the channel and Callum and the council and Arthur saying welcome. She told it in order, with the detail it deserved, without the management that comes from not being ready to be heard. Her aunt listened through all of it. She said very little except the things that needed saying. When Lena was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother would be pleased." Lena sat with this. She looked at the territory boundary where the pale sky met the dark of the trees. "I think so too," she said. She drove home. She made dinner and ate it at the table and washed up and sat in the chair by the window for a while before bed. The channel was quiet from this distance, ambient at the edge of range, present but not intrusive. She sat with it the way you sit with good company that does not need to perform its presence. She thought, yes, just that. The word she was going to give Arthur in 6 weeks. The word she had already given herself, tonight, in the car, in the ordinary miracle of a phone call where she said the true thing, and the person on the other end held it without flinching. Yes. She went to bed. She left the curtain open so the streetlight came in the way it always did, and she lay in it and thought about the word enough. You did not need to be finished to begin. You did not need to be whole to be sufficient. You needed to be enough, and enough was not a fixed quantity. It was whatever you had available, offered honestly, in the direction of what mattered. She was enough. She had been enough for a while. She was, at last, fully convinced of it. March arrived the way March always arrives in the mountains, with the particular stubbornness of a season that knows what it is but has not yet decided to commit to it. The snow was still present in the mornings, a thin and unconvincing layer that melted by midday, and the trees held the moment between bare and beginning with the careful tension of something that has learned not to rush. She walked to the clearing at 7 in the morning. She had been doing this for 3 weeks now, coming early, before the main building had the full weight of its daily activity, before the channels of the day had opened into their full range. She brought coffee in the thermos and her laptop and sometimes a book, and she sat in the shelter on the moss-covered boards and she worked and she listened, and the March light came through the absent roof in its pale and growing way, and the carved trees stood their ground in their old, particular quiet. The shelter was being repaired. She had noticed the first sign of it 2 weeks ago, 2 new boards laid over the worst of the rotted ones, fitted carefully so the character of the old structure was not disturbed. She had not said anything. A week later, a corner post that had been leaning at a meaningful angle stood straight. This week, the worst gaps in the south wall had been filled with new wood matched as closely as possible to the old. She had not asked who had done it. She knew who had done it. She set her coffee on the board beside her. She opened her laptop. She was these days working on something other than legal contracts. She was still doing those, they were still the income. She was not romantic about the practical, but beside them she had opened a different document 3 weeks ago and was adding to it slowly, the way you add to something that does not need to be finished in any particular time frame, and can therefore be given only what it genuinely needs. She did not know yet what it was. It was the kind of writing that discovers itself as it goes. The channel opened at 7:15. He was in the main building, she thought. The quality of the channel was interior, focused and considered, the version she associated with him at his desk. He had a meeting in the morning with the regional council. which was a body she had begun to understand operated above the territory level and carried the kind of authority that made even his specific gravity pay attention. She had asked him about it last night, and he had explained its function with the precision of someone who took structure seriously and who understood that she was building a map and needed accurate information for it. She was building a map. She had been building it for weeks. Not a physical one, she had the territory maps, she had studied them, she knew the ridge and its boundaries and the 6 named access points and the difference between the public easements and the pack-held land. This was a different kind of map, the one you build of a life that is not yet fully visible to you, the sketch made in advance of the full drawing, the provisional lines that tell you roughly where you are going even while the destination remains undefined. Her map had more lines on it than it had 2 months ago. She was sipping her coffee and thinking about one of the provisional lines, a specific practical question about the formal terms of the Council's recognition, and what those terms implied for her living situation, which she had not fully resolved but which Callum had offered 3 separate forms of, all of which were reasonable, and one of which she was leaning toward, the one that made the most sense geographically and practically without requiring her to give up the smaller apartment immediately. Because she was still in the process of finishing something in that apartment, and she was not ready to close the door until she was sure she had taken everything she needed from the room. The channel shifted. She knew the shift. She had catalogued it months ago in the early days when she was still assembling the vocabulary. This was the interior t'other movement, the moment when the ambient, working quality of the channel narrowed to the second register, the wolf. She held her coffee and listened. It was the wolf's conversational register. Not urgent, not searching, not the careful gentleness she had felt on the night at her kitchen table in January. This was the ordinary register of 2 things that know each other so completely the ordinary exchanges have a worn and comfortable quality, the smoothness of a path used often. She could not hear words. She could hear tone. She sat with the thermos warm in her hands and she listened to the ordinary morning exchange of a man and the other part of himself, and what she felt in it was daily. That was the word for it. The quality of something that happens every day without needing to be significant, and is, precisely because of that regularity, one of the most significant things a person can have. She thought about her mother. She had called her aunt in February, the only family she had left, her mother's younger sister, who lived in a different part of the country and who she had not spoken to properly since the funeral. She had called and they had talked for 2 hours, which was longer than they had talked in years. And at the end of the call her aunt had said, "Your mother would be pleased," in that particular aunt voice that carries more than it says. She had not known what specifically her aunt thought her mother would be pleased about, but she had suspected, and she had put the phone down and sat in her apartment for a few minutes, and felt something she had not felt since April, the specific, complicated warmth of being known by someone who knew you before you knew yourself. The channel narrowed further. She felt it come into full focus the way the signal always did when his attention became singular, when whatever else was occupying the space of him stepped back, and one thing occupied the front. This time the thing at the front was in her direction. She was a fixed point on the morning's map. She had been a fixed point for a while now, she suspected. The channel had made its way to her at sufficient range and frequency that she understood she was not an occasional feature of his awareness but an established one. The way a landmark becomes established. First noticed, then recognized, then simply there, part of the picture expected. He was saying something to the wolf. She could not hear it. She received the shape of the words without the content, the texture of something quiet and deliberate, said in the register that did not edit, said the way things are said when you are sure of your company. And then the channel did something it had never done before. He said it knowing she was listening. She understood this because the quality was entirely different from every previous time she had received content from the channel. Every other time she had received what she received as a consequence of proximity and range, the accidental benefit of a signal that was cast without awareness of her. Even the night at her kitchen table, she was certain now that he had not known, that the wolf had let it reach her and then told him after. That had been received, not sent. This was sent. This was a man who knew his signal reached her, who understood the range, who had established over 3 months of careful and attentive presence that she could hear the shape of things even without the words. This was a man who chose, this morning in the pale March light, with the meeting an hour away and the shelter freshly boarded, and the spring still deciding whether to begin, This was a man who chose to say something into the channel knowing she was on the other end of it. She held her coffee in both hands. She felt the shape of what he said. She held it the way she had learned to hold the channel lightly, fully, without gripping. She turned it over. She let it settle into the part of her that received these things. 4 words would not do it justice this time. There were not 4 words for it. There was not a sentence. It was the shape of something that does not live in sentences, that exists below the level of language, that language was invented to approximate. She had felt it from him for months. Now he sent it. She sat in the broken, no, not broken, the repaired shelter. The shelter that had been a ruin long enough to become part of the landscape and was now, quietly, board by board and post by post, being made into somewhere a person could stay. She sat in it and she received what he sent and she held it and she did not cry, which she had been doing less of lately, not because things were easier in the way that easy means painless, but because the particular thing that had made her cry, the specific accumulated loneliness of a life that had been emptied and not yet filled, had been, slowly and without announcement, changing shape. She was not empty. She had not been empty for a while. She set her thermos down on the repaired board beside her. She closed her laptop. She looked at the absent roof and the March sky that was pale and clear and very large, the way sky is large when you are not inside and there is nothing between you and the full extent of it. The channel was quiet. It had the quality of something that has said what it needed to say and is now simply present, not requiring anything in return, not waiting for acknowledgement. Just open, warm, there. She thought, I hear you. Not with the quality of an address this time, not the careful, exploratory thought she had sent toward the wolf months ago in the shelter, the tentative hello of someone not sure of reception. This was a statement, received, understood, held. She did not know if the channel carried it back to him. She thought it did. She picked up her thermos and drank the last of the coffee. It was still warm. She had gotten better at holding things in a way that kept the warmth in them. She thought this was probably a practical skill. She thought it was also the other thing. At 8:45 she walked back down the carved tree corridor and through the territory to the main building. She went to the kitchen. She made tea. She got the mug from its place. It lived here now on the second shelf, no longer borrowed and never quite returned because the returning had stopped feeling necessary and the keeping had stopped feeling like anything other than what it was. She took the tea and the mug to the small table in the corner of the common room. Callum came in at 8:55 on his way to the meeting and he stopped at the table for a moment. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The look was the one that was most itself, not managing, not measuring, just looking. She had studied it for months. She understood it now the way she understood his breathing and the quality of the channel and the difference between his wolf's patience and his own. She understood it because it was the same look she was giving him. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. He went to his meeting. She put her hands around the mug and felt the warmth of it and opened her laptop and found the document she was adding to slowly, the one that did not know what it was yet, the one she was giving only what it genuinely needed. She wrote, outside the deep-set windows the March light was growing. The snow that had been there in the morning was gone from the yard. The carved trees at the edge of the territory stood in their old silence, and somewhere in the clearing the repaired shelter held its new boards in its old frame, and the absent roof let in a square of sky that was pale and clear and getting warmer by degrees, slowly, the way everything gets warmer without announcement, without the dramatic arrival of a single warm day, just the accumulated insistence of the light coming back. The channel was warm and steady. She wrote until noon without looking up. Her hands, for the first time in as long as she could honestly trace it, were not holding on to anything. Not the thermos, not the mug, not the edge of the table. They were moving. Across keys, across language, across the full alive ordinary territory of someone who has been still for a long time and has finally, without fanfare, without a moment that announces itself as the moment, begun to move. She was not afraid. She had not been afraid for a while. She had just not been paying attention. She went home at 4. She drove the 6 miles through the pale beginning of March and the town with its hardware store and its diner and its library, and she pulled into her parking space and sat for a moment in the car with the engine off. The smaller apartment was above her. She had been here 7 months. She had come here in August with her boxes and her depleted savings and her careful accounting of what she had and what she needed and the gap between them, And she had set her boxes down and she had made coffee and she had looked at the window and the streetlight through it and she had thought, all right, this is where we are, let's begin. She had not known what beginning meant then. She had understood it as survival, as the maintenance of forward motion. She had not understood that beginning was also about opening, about the slow and necessary work of becoming permeable again after the walls go up. She had not understood that the most important thing she would find in the next 7 months was not stability or income or a new professional identity, though she had found all of those. The most important thing she had found was the evidence that she was not, at her core, closed. She was not closed. She had thought she might be. She had thought the year had sealed something, had cauterized the place where openness had lived and replaced it with scar tissue. Scar tissue was useful, it protected, it held things together. But it did not feel, and she had been afraid that she had traded feeling for protection without being asked, without deciding, simply as a consequence of what had happened. She was not afraid of that anymore. She gathered her bag, she went upstairs, she put the kettle on. She stood in her kitchen in the March afternoon and thought about what was going to change and what was going to stay the same. The contracts staying, she liked the work, she was good at it and it was honest and she did not require it to be more than what it was. The smaller apartment for now staying, she would not rush the transition, she would let it be complete in its own time and the time would become clear when it became clear. The library staying, obviously, the library was permanent. The document she was adding to, staying and growing, she was 2 months into it now and it had shape. Not a final shape, she did not know its final shape yet, but shape. She could feel its structure the way you feel the structure of a building while it is still being built, by the bones of it. It was something she had needed to write for a long time and had not had the language for until the channel opened. The channel had given her a frequency, and the frequency had given her the language. She made her tea, she took it to the window. The street was doing its ordinary March things. A woman walking a dog, a child on a bicycle with training wheels wobbling earnestly. The diner 2 blocks down with its sign lit, the cursive letters of the name legible from here even in the daylight. She had eaten there twice, the soup was good, she planned to eat there again. She thought about the morning in the shelter, the channel at 7:15, interior and considered, his presence at the desk in the main building, his meeting with the regional council, and then in the pale March light with the repaired boards under her and the absent roof above her and the coffee warm in her thermos, the deliberate, knowing, chosen transmission that had arrived in her chest and stayed there. He had known she was listening. He had always known when she was there, she had understood this for months, that her presence in the channel's range was legible to him in some way she could not fully articulate. But this morning he had done something different. He had not merely known she was there. He had spoken to her through the channel, with the channel, using it as a bridge rather than as an internal space. He had sent something across 6 weeks of trust and 3 months of careful attention and 1 hard conversation at a small desk, in an office with February light through the window. She held what he had sent. She thought she would be holding it for a long time. She did not mind, she had space for it. She had made space not deliberately, not as a strategy, but as the natural consequence of setting down what was too heavy and keeping what was real. She had set down a great deal this year. She had ended up with what was real. This was real. She turned from the window, she took her tea to the desk. She opened the document, the one that had shape now, that was building itself slowly in the evenings and the early mornings, and the hours at the territory table when the contracts were done, and she had this instead. She put her hands on the keys. She wrote. She wrote for an hour straight through in the March afternoon, while the channel was quiet and distant and warm, while the world outside the window went about its ordinary business, while the streetlight waited patiently for its turn, while somewhere in the territory the meeting with the regional council resolved itself in the way that his meetings resolved, with authority and precision and the minimum of friction, and the day moved toward evening. She saved the document, she stretched, she went to the kitchen and made more tea. She stood at the window in the early evening and thought about the word sweet. It was in the title she had not consciously given to her own story, the word she had not known she was saying when she said it first, to no one, to herself, in the car after the council hearing in December. She had been driving home and the channel had been at its evening ambient, and she had thought about the morning and the hearing and Callum's voice in the stone room, and she had thought about the secondary register, the way it had been carrying for weeks, the way she received it at range in her apartment, the way she sat in its edges and understood the shape of him. She had thought how sweet it is. Not the romance of it, or not only that. She had meant the specific sweetness of knowing a thing that the known thing did not know you knew. Not advantage, she had never experienced it as advantage. She had experienced it as intimacy at the strangest possible remove, knowing his unguarded self before he knew she knew it, sitting in the long process of falling for someone while they were looking the other way, the sweetness of a secret that was not unkind, the sweetness of loving someone's private self. And now he knew she had been listening, and he had spoken into the channel knowing she was there. The sweetness had changed. It had not diminished, she would have expected it to, expected that the revelation of the secret would dissolve the quality of the sweetness, the way light dissolves a shadow. But the sweetness had not dissolved, it had converted into something that did not require the secret, that did not depend on the asymmetry, the sweetness of knowing becoming the sweetness of being known. She was being known. She was letting it happen, she was not afraid of it. She put her tea down on the windowsill and thought about tomorrow. She was going to the territory. She was going to sit at the table in the common room or in the shelter in the March light, and she was going to work on the contracts and then on the document, and he was going to be there or he wasn't, and the channel was going to be warm and ambient and present, and she was going to be exactly where she was. She was going to stop counting the steps. She was going to stop accounting for herself. She was going to simply be located as she was, as she had been for months without fully claiming it. This was her life. These were her coordinates. This was the table she had walked to without a map and found by the momentum of a wrong turn and a dead phone and 7 months of putting herself back together one piece at a time. She walked back to the desk, she sat down. She opened the document. She wrote one more line and then she stopped writing and looked at it. It was a good line. It was the line that had been waiting at the end of the document since she started it, the line the whole thing had been moving toward, the one she had not been able to write until she was ready. She was ready. She saved it. She closed the laptop and went to bed early, which she almost never did, because she was tired in the best way, the tired of a person who has done the thing they were supposed to do, who has arrived where they were going, who can finally, without performance, without pretense, without the small dignifying fictions she had been sustaining for 7 months, be still. The channel was quiet at this range. She held it like a compass in the dark, not reading it, not decoding it, simply knowing it was there, knowing he was on the other end of it, knowing she was on hers. She slept. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she slept all the way to morning.